Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored with the College of Education, Housing and Dining Services, K-State First, the Office of Diversity, and Student Governing Association. And we thank all of them for helping us be able to do this lecture tonight. We could not have done it without the help of all the groups on campus to make this happen. I'd also like to recognize those that are hosting tables over here. We have Reimagine Manhattan, Black Student Union, Cats for Inclusion, First Congregational Church, and UFM. Please take some time when the lecture's over if you'd like to visit with them and learn more about those organizations. Before we begin tonight's program, we have a special activity for you. We are going to be honoring 4 recipients of the Joey Lee Garman Scholarship for Social Justice. And I'd like to introduce Anita Cortez, who is the director of the university's Developing Scholars Program, who will introduce those students. Anita.
Good evening. The Joey Lee Garman Scholarship was started by a single student. Her name is Barbara Baker. She saw social injustice in our community and chose to address it through positive actions. This scholarship, now sponsored by Educational Opportunity Funds, is especially meaningful because it is a commitment by K-State students to the values of social justice within our own university community and beyond. Recipients are chosen for their actions in support of social justice. This year's recipients are Jackie Wynn, who is a senior in hospitality management. Congratulations. Evelyn Lucio, who is a sophomore in American Ethnic Studies and Pre-Law. Alonzo Pena, a junior in American Ethnic Studies. And Vajesh Velalagan, junior in Biochemistry and Microbiology. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Anita, and congratulations to all these deserving students. Now I would like to introduce Joe Sutliff Sanders, who's an associate professor of English, who's going to introduce our speaker for the evening. Joe.
Welcome, everyone, to tonight's Lou Douglas Lecture. My name is Joe Sutliff Sanders. I'm a professor of children's literature here at Kansas State University. The goal of the Lou Douglas series is, quote, to extend understanding of public policies that can further democratize society and jolt conventional wisdom, end quote. These lectures, quote, propose public policy that deals progressively and democratically with the roots of social, political, and economic problems. With this description in mind, you might be wondering why it took us so long to invite Tim Wise. Mr. Wise is the author of 7 books, including his most recent 2015's Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. And next year we'll see the release of his brilliantly titled White Lies Matter, Race, Crime, and the Politics of Fear in America. As a boy, Wise went to preschool at Tennessee State University, a historically black university, where he began the lifelong process of learning how to identify with and respect people who came from different backgrounds. As a college student in Louisiana, he agitated against apartheid in South Africa. One day, a black woman challenged him to continue the work for justice abroad while also joining the work that needed to be done in his own community. It was then that Wise realized, as he has since put it, I had the privilege of choosing to address racism 8,000 miles away. He therefore began to work locally, for example, in the campaigns to defeat neo-Nazi and white supremacist political candidate David Duke, who ran for for the U.S. Senate and then governor, and lost. And he later began working as a community organizer in New Orleans public housing. In the decades since, he has worked and fought and written and taught. I use his writings in my own classes, including one course that explores how children's literature tests philosophies of difference in our communities. And my students have found especially helpful work from his 2010 book, Colorblind, The Rise of Post-Racial Politics and the Retreat from Racial Equity. Colorblindness, the false dream offered by both liberals and conservatives, is an especially tenacious philosophy, but year after year, I have students tell me how powerfully useful they've found Wise's work. As when he explains how, for example, quote, colorblindness, by encouraging teachers, physicians, employers, and others to ignore or downplay race, actually results in their ill-serving the needs of the people who are confronted by racism, thereby actually helping to replicate it. I'd say that jolts conventional wisdom, wouldn't you? In a recent public dialogue with the legendary radical activist, scholar, and author Angela Davis, he said that those of us who are not the targets of Islamophobia and of racism and of sexism and of straight supremacy and cisgendered supremacy and the class system must be willing to challenge those forms of bigotry or they are going to continue. He then insists that there is one crucial question for us. Are we brave enough to act in solidarity with those who are being targeted? Friends and colleagues, I give you your Lou Douglas lecturer for this evening, Tim Wise.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, it's good to be back. First of all, what is up with this crowd? It's like, yay for extra credit. What the hell is that? Man, extra credit and academic bribery still counts for some shit. I love that. I was a student. I remember, man, you can't come to every lecture, but when the professor says it'll up your grade, you're there. I get it. I'm good. Doesn't matter. Don't care if that's why you're here. Don't care if it's because these are the issues that get you out of bed in the morning or you just came for the grade. Either way, you're here, I'm here, the lights are up. If you get up to leave, I'm going to notice. I will call that shit out. I will humiliate you in front of 1,000 people. So just stay sitting for like an hour. It's an hour of your life. You'll never get it back. But it's not going to be that painful, or it might be, but you'll survive, I promise. Thank you for coming. Yeah, it's going to be like that all night. It's good to be back. I was here actually the first time. I was thinking about it on the way over, walking over from the hotel, and I was thinking about the first time I was here. It was 96, and it was actually 20 years ago this week, I think. And was that like a clap? Like, oh, you're still alive. You're so old. Oh, that's awesome. So proud of you. If I can get a clap for that, the rest of the night's going to be great. Like, it's going to be no problem. No, it's like 20 years ago this week, right? And I remember being here, and I remember it very specifically because I remember getting up to speak, and during the Q&A, which we'll do after this, as they said, it was right before a presidential election, yes? And so I remember, folks, it was Clinton versus Dole. Remember when the Republican Party nominated people like Robert Dole? You remember that? And, yeah, some of you don't. They used to do that, actually. And it was Clinton versus Dole, and people were like, what should we do? I remember getting that question, like, what should we do? What do you think? And I don't endorse people for president. I just don't do that. Like, I'm much more likely to unendorse somebody, like to tell you what not to do than what to do. I just remember in 96, I was like, first of all, it was obvious who was going to win, and I was like, And Bill Clinton had actually lied to me personally about some stuff about a year earlier when he agreed to originally not sign that horrible welfare reform bill, but then he went ahead and signed it because Dick Morris and a bunch of right-wing policy analysts and consultants told him to. And so I was sort of angry at Bill Clinton. I'm like, just do what you want. Yeah, I don't say that shit anymore. This year's a little different. So if you ask me that question, I'm not going to give you just a do what you want answer, just so you know ahead of time, right? We might go there this evening. In fact, probably we'll be there in about 5 minutes, so just hang in. I want to start, I've already sort of started, as you can tell, but I want to start by acknowledging all the folks that made it possible for this event to happen. Thank you for sponsoring the event. Congratulations to the winners up here a second ago. My original plan was to shake your hand, but then I was over here on this side and you were on this side, and it would have been weird and creepy, like Donald Trump walking behind Hillary Clinton during the debate, to like come over here and be like, oh. And then I would have had to hump the chair like Donald Trump did during the debate, which would have been extra creepy. If you didn't see that, Google that shit, like it's out there. 55 more minutes, folks. 55 more minutes. That's all you got to hang in for. 55 minutes. It's not going to get any easier, but it's 55 minutes. That's all. I also want to thank and particularly acknowledge the BSU folks who were in the first couple of rows here in particular. And I want to acknowledge them for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, because they have a table over there that I want everyone to check out, and I want everyone to really understand the work that the BSU, both on this campus and so many other campuses where organizations either called BSU or the equivalent of that exist, how important it is for those groups to continue to lead the struggle for racial equity on our campuses. But I also want to call them out in particular because here's the thing. I'm about to say some really good stuff. I promise. Like, I worked on this. You know, I did. But all of the stuff that I'm going to say, virtually every word of it, is the kind of thing that the folks in the BSU, and I would say even folks who are not members of the BSU but are people of color on this campus, have said 20 times since last Wednesday. And the question is, the real question is not whether I say it and you applaud and laugh when I tell you funny shit. And whether you walk away from here going, oh, that was a really good talk. I really enjoyed that. Oh, I'm glad I went to that. The real question and the real challenge for all of us, not just those of you on the campus, but just in the larger society, right, is whether or not we're prepared to hear truth when it does not come in this aesthetic. When it does not look like this, when it is not white, and when it is not male, and when it is not straight, and when it is not cisgendered, and when it is not middle-aged, and when it is not college-educated, and when it is not able-bodied, when it does not embody all of these dominant groups. Because, see, folks of color say this stuff all the time. Women of all colors say it all the time. LGBT folks say it all the time. Working class people say it all the time. Folks with disabilities say it all the time. Folks who face obstacles on the basis of their identity are the experts on this shit. And I will be more than happy to amplify their voice, and I will be more than happy to have their back this evening. But the real test is whether we can hear them when they say it without having to then run it through my mouth before everybody accepts it. So when we get there, then we won't have to have this talk, but we ain't there yet, so we're going to have it. 51 more minutes. So here's the deal. I've been at this for a minute. Like I said, I've been here the first time 20 years ago, but that was a year and a half after I first got out on the road. So I've been doing this work on the road for 22 years, roughly 21, 22 years, and have been doing anti-racism work in one capacity or another for 25, quarter century. And in that quarter century, I can tell you without fear of contradiction that rarely, if ever, in fact, I'm just going to say never, have I felt that we were at as dangerous a moment as we are right now with regard to these issues in our country. Never before have I really felt, even in the early 90s, when I was engaged in that work, as you heard in the intro, against David Duke, former Klan leader, lifelong white supremacist. You heard in the intro neo-Nazi, but that's sort of giving him credit for thinking of some new shit, because that's what neo means, and David hasn't really had an original thought since the Third Reich. It's sort of old school Nazi. It's Jurassic Nazi, Paleolithic Nazi. That's some old shit, but but that's the word that we use. Even then, I didn't feel as though we were at a moment as dangerous as this. A moment where the very concept of multiracial democracy is being attacked and questioned. For years, I would go around and I would talk about how, the dominant paradigm in higher education and corporate America for several years, right, has been diversity. That's been the buzzword, diversity. How do we promote diversity? And my thing was always like, man, that's some weak-ass tea. Like, diversity, what does that even mean? Like, that's just basic biology. Like, if it wasn't for biological biodiversity, we wouldn't have existed as a species. It's like, that's weak. If that's the best you can promote, if that's all you got, we haven't really gotten very far. But damn, even that, now, I thought that was settled, right? I think a lot of us thought diversity was settled. Now we just had to talk about equity. But see, apparently not, because apparently even diversity, even the basic contours of multiculturalism are under attack. We got folks that want to build walls rather than open doors to people looking for a better life. We got folks who want to implement national stop and frisk racial profiling to deal with crime because it works so fabulously in New York. The hell it did. Y'all ever actually study stop and frisk in New York City? That shit was so pathetic that 94% of the people that got stopped, 4.5 million people over a 9 to 10 year period, 94% of them didn't even end up with a ticket for jaywalking because they hadn't done anything. They hadn't committed any crime. It wasn't a successful policy. You know how often they found weapons? That was the purpose of it. And that's the purpose for which some, once again, want to justify it. Oh, that's the way you get guns off the street. You get guns off the street by doing stop and frisk. They had 4.5 million stops. You know how many times they found guns? They found 4,500 guns out of 4.5 million stops. Do the math. That is 1/10 of 1% of the time they found a gun. Now, I could do better than that in Manhattan, just walking down the damn street and tapping people. I could just walk down the streets of New York and be like, you got a gun? You'd be like, damn, you got me. But the cops, 99.9% of the time, didn't find what they were looking for. They said they were looking for drugs, but they didn't find drugs except in 1.2% of the time. And they found drugs more often on white folks than black and brown folks, but they kept stopping black and brown folks. So when somebody tells you that's the answer to crime, they are lying to you, but they are trying to convince their supporters who are afraid of black people that that's going to be the solution to the problem. That's where we are as a country. Build walls, racially profile people, keep certain people from coming into the country altogether. That is what they're advocating. We weren't hearing that 20 years ago. We were hearing plenty of scary stuff 20 years ago, and 15 and 10 years ago, and God knows 50 years ago, but we have literally come back in time to a place when folks want to implement some of the most authoritarian, pseudo-fascist policies this country has ever seen. That is why I tell you that this is dangerous. And we better take this really, really seriously, not just in an electoral context, but in the social context, because regardless of the outcome of an election, man, it's not one individual candidate who is the problem. Just like with David Duke, the problem was never Duke, it was Dukeism. It was the mentality that said we're going to blame other people for problems they didn't create. For Duke, that meant blaming black folks, right? His thing was, oh, white people can't find jobs because black people have taken all the jobs thanks to affirmative action. We still hear that shit. First of all, where the hell have black people taken all these jobs? The hell, black folks are twice as likely as white folks to be out of work, even when they have a college degree. So wherever the hell they took these jobs, they didn't take them very far. Where the hell are these jobs that people of color stole from white people? Are they in Second Life? Are these jobs on Minecraft or some shit? Where are these jobs? The hell are folks talking about? You took my job. First of all, if you didn't have the job yet, it wasn't yours. Little pro tip. Okay? They took my job. Really? Had you been hired yet? No. Well, then it wasn't yours, Jack. That's how that shit works. Just so you know, right? I mean, if you had the job and they fired you to replace you with somebody, then you might have a complaint, but that's not what happened, is it? No. And the Mexicans took all the jobs. Where'd they take them? Latino folk, including Chicano folk, Mexican-American folk, and recent immigrants, still, overall, Latino folks 50% more likely to be out of work than white folks, even when they have a college degree. Asian American folk, 25% more likely to be out of work than white folks, even with a college degree. Our Native brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples, 2/3 more likely than white folks to be out of work, even with a college degree. So all of this nonsense scapegoating people of color for the problems of white people, which David Duke perfected a quarter century ago, we're still hearing that. And it's not any more true today than it was then, but folks like to play on folks' fears and anxieties, figuring that they won't actually Google anything, won't actually look it up. Social science doesn't matter. It's just what's in your gut. Doesn't matter what's real. Doesn't matter what the facts say. Right? It's what you think is real. Right? And so that's why we're back at this place again. The problem has never been individual candidates. It's been a mentality. It's been a mindset. A mindset that says, once upon a time, this was a great country. But something happened, right? And we lost our way. And that's why we have to make America great again, like it was back in, when exactly? When exactly was that shit? When exactly was America awesome? And I don't just mean for some people, I mean for the vast majority of people, because I can't think of a moment, not one day, 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 second, when this country was great for people of color. Not 1 minute. I can't think of a moment previous in history when it was ever great for working class or low-income folks of any color. What, was it great when white children were working in mines and factories at the age of 12? Was that awesome? Nah, that was horrible. Was it ever good for women as women facing patriarchy, misogyny, rape culture still not addressed? Was it ever good for them? No. Was it ever good for LGBTQ folks? No. So the only people it was ever really great for were white, upper middle class, affluent, straight Christian men. So when we say make America great again, let's just be clear what we're talking about and for whom we are talking about it and to whose benefit we are speaking, because for the vast majority of us, we're still waiting for America to be great once. Once. And if it's ever going to be that, that's on you and that's on me. It's not going to be up to one person of any political party to do that. We have to do that work, and we have to reject the idea that somehow this nostalgic view of America, based on a fictive past that never existed, is worth going back to. We have to think about moving forward, not backward, but that's the challenge that we face in this country. Do we look back to this fictional time, this nostalgic, simplistic, supposedly innocent time, which wasn't innocent for the targets of oppression? It was only innocent in the eyes of those who didn't think about what they were involved in and what they were doing. Or do we look forward to multiracial democracy? Because I fundamentally believe we can figure this out as a people. I think we're smart people, and I think most people are good people. And I think most people are caring and compassionate people. Even when you're caught up in a bad system, it doesn't make you a bad person, see? But the problem is when you're caught up in bad systems, it can warp your thinking. And so we've got to think systemically. We have to think about how we're going to build together something different and leave something different to our children. That's where we're at right now. It's a very dangerous time. We have people that are trying to move us backward in very direct ways, not just metaphorical ways, but quite literally, right? Trying to make it harder for people to vote. I want you to think about that for a minute. Right? What does it mean that apparently, as a country, we've only discovered the problem of voter fraud since 2008? Isn't that fascinating, right? Some folks are like, oh, we got to really tighten up on this voting shit. Because, some people, like Donald Trump said, they'll vote 10 times. So, who's to keep them from voting 10 times? Even though there's no evidence anyone's ever done that in the history of American elections. Not any evidence, but you can just say whatever the hell you want. And people will believe it, because it's on Breitbart. People will vote 10 times. Do I need any evidence of that? No, but it doesn't matter, because they'll do it, because there's no ID required. If there's no ID required, they're going to vote 10 times. Okay, here's the problem with that. First of all, there have been 31 cases of in-person voter fraud in the last 15 years. I will say it again, 31 cases of in-person voter fraud in the last 15 years. You cannot steal your 8th grade student council election with 31 votes. Yo, do you understand? Like, that shit will not even take your middle school student council election away from your opponent, let alone a national election. That's number one. Number two is, why in the hell would you commit voter fraud in this country. Do you have any idea what the penalty is for that? Any idea what it is? It's like 5 years in prison and up to a $10,000 fine. I mean, it's like not a minor crime. You can get in serious trouble. Why would you go to that trouble just to vote twice? Why would anyone risk that? Like, I understand risking, like, bank robbery. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying, like, there's money in there. Like, I get it. Like, you're broke, you want money, rob a bank, that's where the money is. I get it. Voter fraud? Why the hell would you do that? Let me ask you a question. Has there ever been an election ever that ended up in a tie and you were thinking to yourself, shit, if I just voted twice, my guy would have won? That has never happened in the history of voting. So people who say that are not really worried about voter fraud. So why would they want voter photo ID? Real simple, because we know who's less likely to have a photo ID. Low-income folks, because they might not drive, because they might not have a bank account that requires them to have a photo ID, because they don't have banks in a lot of low-income communities. They have to rely on other secondary sources of income, and places for income. So the differences between low-income folks disproportionately of color and non-low-income folks disproportionately white is just sufficient enough to where if you impose this requirement, you're not going to stop fraud, but you're going to stop a lot of legitimate voters of color from being able to vote. Same thing with early voting. Why the hell we got to shut down early voting to stop voter fraud? Where's any evidence that people vote early and commit voter fraud? There's none. There's not even an allegation of it. Not one single case that you can find of someone voting early committing voter fraud. But folks are like, well, we got, and they'll say things like this. They'll say, well, if you really are an American and you want to vote, you ought to go out on election day, damn it. If you really care about this country. That's sort of funny, because you know how many folks send in absentee ballots? And do you know what they look like? See, disproportionately, people that vote absentee are white and upper middle class because they're on business trips and shit. Well, I can't go on election day because I'm flying in an airplane going to make a deal somewhere. But the people who disproportionately vote early because they got to work 2 shifts on election day are working class, low income, and people of color. So we're not really serious when we say, well, if you're really an American, you'd go out to vote. You'd make time on election day. Because these folks don't want to shut down absentee ballots. They just want to shut down early voting. And let's be honest, absentee voting is the easiest way to commit fraud. The easiest way, right? Because if you want to commit fraud, that's what you would do. You would send in an absentee ballot in somebody else's name, hope that they don't show up on election day, and you'd get away with it. You don't have to show an ID for that. Nobody's checking that. And not one of the people that wants to shut down early voting or impose photo ID for voters says anything about absentee ballots, because they're lying. This isn't about fraud. This is about disenfranchising working class people, low-income folks, people of color, also disenfranchising students, because they don't want y'all to use your student ID. That's the other thing. Oh, no. Can't use a student ID. They'll fake that. Right? Yeah, because I remember when I was a college student thinking to myself, you know what? I need a fake ID. And you know why? Because I want to vote 10 times. Yeah. That's not the reason for which I had a fake ID, and it's not the reason that at least half of y'all in this room have one right now. Not about voting. The people with fake ID not even going to show up on election day because they're sleeping it off. I remember. Right? But they will let you show up with your gun registration ID. Oh, yeah. If you own a gun, you got a concealed carry permit. Oh, yeah, that shit counts, because nobody would ever lie in order to get a gun in America. Why would you do that? Why would you lie about who you were to get a gun? It's obvious you'd be far more likely to lie so you could vote. Right? That's kind of insanity we're dealing with. So just want you to understand how dangerous it is. We got some folks that are real blatant about this, though. Right? Some folks don't even hide it. Like the people that talk about photo ID, at least they hide it. They're like, oh, well, voter fraud. Some folks don't even pretend, right? Like Rush Limbaugh, who used to be relevant, says things like, well, if you don't own any property, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to vote. Right? Brian Fisher, the head of the American Family Association, says the same thing. Right? Judson Phillips, the head of the largest Tea Party organization in this country, says the same thing. If you're not a property owner, you ought not be allowed to vote. Ted Nugent, washed-up guitar player and a avid hunter who would make even the most pacifist among us wish that deer could shoot back. That guy, right, has said that if you receive any kind of welfare, quote unquote, you ought not be allowed to vote. Of course, he doesn't really mean it, right, because welfare is all in the eye of the beholder. He only means certain people. I don't think he actually means that all those Wall Street bankers that got bailed out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars aren't going to be allowed to vote. I don't think he means that the corporations who receive 10 times as much subsidy as all the poor people combined in this country on an annual basis shouldn't be allowed to vote. He's just talking about poor folks, right? You have, what's her name that used to be on The View? Now she's on Fox because it's a far better place. What's her name? Hasselbeck. Elizabeth Hasselbeck, right? She's actually said that you ought to have to pass a civics test to vote. Right? You probably thought we had handled that like several generations ago, that we'd sort of solved that question already about having to pass a government civics test, a test of American history in order to vote. Of course, the irony of her saying that, right, is that if in fact such a rule existed, given the fact that the Supreme Court has already said that that shit is unconstitutional, that means that Elizabeth Hasselbeck would be the first one to have to give up her voter registration card because we've already said that the shit that she just advocated is not legal. So maybe this is not a bad idea. But I just want to make sure we test the right people. That's all that I would advocate. But this is where we're at. And so we have to really make a decision. Who are we going to be? Because it's real clear what some folks want us to be. Right? They want to go back to this fictive time, and we've got to be prepared to move forward. So what does that mean? And how do we get there? And what's preventing us from getting there? Because it seems to me that if we're going to eradicate racism in the so-called, as the title of the talk says, post-Obama era, we have to be very clear about what some of the obstacles are to doing that, right? And the obstacles, I think, are both maybe easier to understand and more complicated at the same time than what we expect. Easier in the sense that they're relatively obvious and not real hard to imagine, but obviously more complicated in the sense that if they were easy to actually take action upon, we'd have done it already. So here's what I mean. It seems to me the first problem that we have to deal with is acknowledging the way that race and identity shape our perspectives about the social reality that we observe. Now that may seem esoteric. Let me explain what I mean by that. It seems to me one of our biggest problems, right, is that those of us who are white, through no fault of our own necessarily, but just because we've been raised in this sort of miasma of, philosophical privilege, if not material, psychological privilege, if not material, by which I mean the privilege of not having to know other people's reality, right? By which I mean the privilege of being oblivious to black and brown folks' daily reality. As a result, we look around and we can't understand. We can't understand anything from the uprising with regard to police unaccountability and violence, to the anger over blackface incidents on a college campus, to the anger and the frustration over the continued use of indigenous mascots for high school teams. We can't understand these things because our reality doesn't really prepare us to see the injury. Right? And it doesn't make us bad people for being oblivious to that, right? It's just that when you don't have to know stuff because you're not the target of it, then it's really easy to miss it, yes? I mean, when you don't have to know reality, the odds are you won't know reality. Everybody's oblivious to something. I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I never took it. You know why? Because they didn't make me. And my thing was, if they ain't going to make me take calculus, I'm sure as hell not taking it voluntarily. And I don't mean that as an offense to anybody in here who loves calculus, teaches calculus, majors in that. I'm glad somebody did. I just knew it wasn't going to be me. That's all. I knew it even in 9th grade. I remember starting freshman year of high school thinking, all right, how do I never take calculus? That's how bright I was, right? I was forward thinking. I was plotting. I was conspiring to make my life as easy as possible. I was 13, man. I was like, how do I not take calculus? I said, I know. They only said I had to take 3 years of math to graduate from the Nashville Public Schools. I'm going to take Algebra 1 over again. I took that shit in 8th grade. Got a B, but I was like, nope, I think I can do better. I didn't. Did worse, but that was all right, because then the next year I took geometry. The next year I took algebra 2. Never even took trig, y'all. And then I was out. No more math. Right? And as a result, I don't know calculus. And so if I were to stand up here and try to do calculus, any of y'all that have ever taken it would be like, yeah, he does not know what the hell he's talking about. And because you've been listening very attentively, you would look at the person next to you. You would say, wait a minute. Didn't he just say he never took the class? Exactly. That is a perfect metaphor for race and identity in this country. Because we have a lot of white folks in this country who think that we know when racism is and is not operating, and we never had to take the damn class. You hear me? We have a lot of men in this country who think that we know when misogyny exists, when rape culture is real and when it's not, more than women who are the targets of it, and we never had to take the damn class. We got a lot of straight folk and cisgendered folk who think that we know when straight supremacy, transphobia, cisgendered supremacy is operating and when it's not, more than those who were the target of it, and we never had to take the class. We got people with money who think they understand poor people in poverty better than the people who live in it, and they didn't take the class. Do you follow what I'm saying? When those who have had to take the class are trying desperately to get the rest of us to hear them, and we don't, it's not necessarily because we're bad, horrible, awful, nasty people. It's because to be a member of the dominant group, whatever group we're talking about, and everyone in here is a member of at least one dominant group, I damn near guarantee it, right? Everybody in here has got some area where you're the privileged one. Right? It may not be racial privilege, may not be economic privilege, may not be gender privilege, may not be sexuality privilege, but if you're able-bodied, you don't face ableism, right? So you don't have to think about the stuff that folks with disabilities face. If you are hearing, you have to think about autism, what people who are deaf experience, right? So every one of us has got at least some area where we're the ones who are oblivious. And being oblivious doesn't make you a bad person. It's not about good people and bad people. It's about how even good people can be caught up in bad, iniquitous systems and become part of those systems. Think about how that works with regard to policing, right? I mean, here we are in a country where unarmed black folks, unarmed, nationwide, data says, unarmed black folks 3.5 times more likely to be shot by police than unarmed white folks. That's a fact. Some communities, it's far worse than that. That's a national aggregate average. Los Angeles is 20-1. New Orleans, where I lived for 10 years, it's 11-1. But 3.5-1 nationwide, not armed, not posing any direct threat, not attacking an officer, 3.5-1. Now, is that because all cops are horrible, racist, nasty people? No, of course not. I think a lot of people get into law enforcement for the right reason, but here's the problem. I can be that quote-unquote good cop, and if I get into a system that encourages brutality, that encourages authoritarian domination and the control of the people that I'm asked to police, that encourages a hostile mindset toward the community I'm policing, I can be twisted beyond all of my best intentions. And there are plenty of examples of this. There's a young dude whose name I always forget, but he worked in Baltimore, in the Baltimore PD for several years. You might have seen, he's been all over YouTube and all over various interviews. You know this guy, this young white dude? Okay, different guy. Young white dude. Looks like he's about 14, but he's older than that because he served in the Marines, and they don't let you do that when you're 12. Right? He went to like Afghanistan or Iraq, came back, wanted to serve the community where he was from. So he joins the Baltimore PD, right? And early on in his career, he's on a call, and not his partner, but one of his colleagues shows up at the call and just beats the hell out of some criminal suspect, right? In a way that's completely unconstitutional, immoral, unethical, illegal, for which he should have lost a job and gone to jail, but of course never does. And this good cop goes and tries to tell the CO, tell the commanding officer, like, wait a minute, there's a problem here. Like, this is not okay. And what does the CO do? Retaliates against this good cop, basically tells him to keep his mouth shut. And then over the course of this young man's career, which doesn't last very long, they basically start easing him out. They start giving him bad assignments, and by bad assignments, it means assignments where you're not going to get a lot of arrests, because he talks about how the whole way that you got promoted was based on how many arrests you made. It wasn't based on how many domestic violence calls you resolved nonviolently. It wasn't based on how many disputes on the street you resolved nonviolently. It wasn't based on how much you might actually reduce the crime rate. It was about how many busts you made. So they would send people out to bust people for dime bags on the street just to get their arrest numbers up, right? But they sent this dude out to like the wealthy neighborhoods in Baltimore where he knew there's plenty of drugs being done, but they're inside. You can't just bust in. So now you're not going to make any arrests, and now your career is going to be over. You're not going to get promoted pretty soon. They work him out of the system altogether. So here's a good dude who finally, when he tries to do the right thing, is basically run out of the force. There was a case, a month ago, and I don't remember what department this was in, but this dude was like fired for not shooting a suspect. How the hell are you going to get fired for not shooting somebody, right? This cop comes upon this guy, and the guy's got a gun, but he's not pointing it at the cop, right? It seems like he's sort of semi-suicidal. He's saying things to the cop like, just shoot me, right? So he's maybe setting up like a suicide by cop thing, right? He's afraid to kill himself, but he wants the cop to do it for him kind of deal. And that happens a lot. It happens a lot. But so this dude, he doesn't seem to want to shoot the cop, and the cop can tell. He's also former military. So he's like trained to know when you're actually dangerous and when you're not. And he's like, I don't want to shoot you, man. That's not why I'm here. So he doesn't want to shoot him. The guy doesn't put the gun at him. He's like, come on, just put the gun down. Let's talk. And then a couple of other of his colleagues from the department show up, and they're not nearly as ecumenical, and they shoot him. And then the guy that gets fired is the one that wouldn't shoot. See, you can be a good cop. But if the system encourages a particular mindset, what does your goodness matter? You might have noticed in Ferguson 2 years ago after the killing of Mike Brown, regardless of what you think about that particular case, at least acknowledge this much. When that uprising in Ferguson took place, I want you to remember some of the visual images from Ferguson. Because when I talk about the culture of law enforcement, as opposed to individual cops, that's the key. The culture's the problem, not individual people. Because you remember when that went down, if you watch the news, right? Remember how folks rolled in, how the cops rolled in to put down that uprising? They rolled in not with police cars, right? Not with wagons. They rolled in with tanks. Decommissioned military equipment brought from the war zones in Afghanistan or Iraq. Now, I want you to keep that image in mind for a minute. Using military equipment, and what message does that send? And then I want you to remember what they were wearing. Because although some of them had traditional police uniforms on, a lot of them didn't. A lot of them were wearing what? Camouflage. Now ask yourself a question. Why do you need camouflage in Ferguson, Missouri? Y'all know what camo looks like. There's two types. Number one, Vietnam War era camo. It's green. It's meant to help you hide in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Or post-1991 Desert Storm and more recent wars in the Middle East camouflage that's khaki and tan, meant to help you hide amongst a sand dune in the so-called Middle East. It's meant to help you blend in. Now, let me ask you, y'all ever been to Ferguson? Are there any jungles or sand dunes that I missed the last time that I was in Ferguson? Because I haven't seen one. So when you roll up in camo meant to hide you in Vietnam or in Saudi Arabia, that shit does not protect you in Ferguson unless your camo looks like a pawn shop, because that's the only place that poor people can get money in this country, because they don't open bank branches. So unless it looks like that and allows you to blend in with an urban environment, you didn't roll up in camo to hide or to protect yourself. You rolled up in camo and a tank for one reason and one reason only, and that was to send a message. And what, pray tell, do you think that message was? That message was, we are at war, and you are the enemy, and this might as well be Fallujah, and we are here to put you down. Now, when we allow law enforcement in this country to treat their own citizenry like enemy combatants, we have lost something precious about what this country is supposed to be. That is a culture of law enforcement that can take even the best of the people in the police department or in the National Guard or any of the law enforcement agencies and or military agencies that are called in to deal with those situations and twist them beyond recognition. So we got to deal with systems. And I get it that we don't see it. I do. Because we've never had to see it. White America doesn't have to know the history of policing vis-a-vis black and brown folks. We can be oblivious to that. And there's no penalty. You can graduate from high school. You can graduate from college. You can graduate from law school, from med school, from business school. You can be considered competent in just about any field and not have to ever really learn that stuff, right? There's no real penalty to being oblivious, and there never has been. So as a result, we don't really know that policing goes back to slave patrols. We don't think about what people of color think about when they look at law enforcement. They know that those are the very folks that enforce black codes. Those are the folks that enforced segregation. Those are the folks that pulled protesters off of lunch counter stools during the sit-ins. Those are the folks that beat protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Those are the folks that turned on water cannons on children in Birmingham, and victims have long memories, right? Some of us have never had to learn that stuff. Some have never had the luxury of forgetting it. And when those of us who are white ask people of color to move past the past, we're asking them to adopt cultural amnesia as a positive good. That shit does not work. Do you understand? We have to be attentive to the reality, because if we're not, then we don't understand. When black folks say Black Lives Matter, we're all, what? But what about my life? My life matters. All lives matter. My life matters. Look, I got 2 children. They're 15 and 13. They're white. I know their damn life matters. I wouldn't have brought them into this world if I didn't think their life mattered. What, you think I don't think my children's lives matters? I know damn good and well they matter. Here's the dirty little secret. So does this country. That's the dirty little secret. This country knows that my daughter's lives matter, and this country has always known before they even existed that their lives matter. The reason we insist Black Lives Matter is because we have done such a damn good job for hundreds of years insisting just the opposite. You have to specify that which has been ignored. That is the fact. You have to call out that which has been undeclared. To say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, just to give you an idea of the absurdity of this, right? It's like going back to the early 70s, which most of y'all won't remember, but in the early 70s, the big saying was black is beautiful, right? That was the big saying, because black folks were trying to reclaim beauty standards from a Eurocentric model that had sort of dominated, whether it was in fashion or glamour or Hollywood or whatever it was, right? So black folks were saying black is beautiful. It'd be like all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like getting in a time machine, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say black is beautiful, and then saying like, well, but we're all beautiful in our own way. Yeah, shut up. We know. It's not the point. You have to specify that which has been ignored. That's why we don't have White History Month, yo, because we got a bunch of them. They just go by these tricky-ass names, May, June, July, August. You don't have to... You don't have to call it White History Month. It's just by default, right? It's not about, oh, they matter more than other lives. No black person saying that. No person who's non-black advocating Black Lives Matter is saying that. See, the problem, and this is what we don't learn, but black and brown folks know intuitively, is that we as a country have a very long history of saying all and not meaning it. So, for instance, we said, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I don't think I need to remind you that at the moment that that shit got said, the people that said it did not mean it, right? And we have a Pledge of Allegiance that ends with the words, liberty and justice for all. There's that word again, all. And when the people who wrote it, they did not mean it. So when you hear Black Lives Matter, you can think of that as the asterisk at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance, right? You can think of that as the asterisk in the all men are created equal, the part that says, yeah, by the way, we're part of that shit, right? Because all has generally not included certain folks. That's a way of just reminding the rest of us that it damn sure should and must. It's not a supremacist move, it's an inclusionary move. It's not about taking over the table, it's about a place at the table, an equitable place at the table. But the reason we freak out is because no one's ever really explained it. And I get it. If you weren't taught this, how would you know? I'm not trying to be judgmental. I get it. Like the ignorance, we come by it honestly, right? If you aren't taught this, like you can't teach what you don't know. You can't know what you weren't taught. I get it. That's why we have to do better. You know, I was thinking about this not as an activist or a scholar, but a couple years ago I started thinking about it as a dad. Because like I said, I got these 2 girls. They're 15 and 13, right? And when they were 12 and 10, or as the kids like to say, 12 and a half and 10 and a half, because they like to give them that extra half a year, you know, feel older. I was driving them one day. They're dancers, both of them, and they were dancing in a dance company downtown in Nashville, about 8 minutes away from the school. So we're driving one day from the school to the dance studio, 8-minute drive on surface streets through the city, and we made this drive every day, roughly for a year. But on this particular day, my daughter asked a really interesting question. We got to a red light about halfway through, about 4 minutes into the drive, that happens to be in the middle of a public housing project. Right? So on either side of the street, public housing, almost all people of color, by definition, all poor. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old, whose name is Rachel, says, as we're waiting for the light to turn, she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" That's a damn good question, isn't it? It's a really good sociological inquiry, actually. It's an anthropological question, even though she's 10 and a half and doesn't know what either of those terms mean. But she wanted to know, and it's a great question. Now, here's the thing. I was already, with my answer, because this is sort of the shit that I do, right? So, which, let's be honest, that's why she asked it. If I was an accountant, she wasn't going to ask that. If I was an accountant, she'd have just been like, "Dad, how do I do my taxes?" I'd have been like, "You're 10. Don't worry about it. Call me in 15 years." But because I do what I do, she thought, maybe Daddy will know the answer to this. So she asked the question, right? And, of course, now here's what I didn't know was going to happen, because I'm an only child. But if any of you were siblings or have an older sibling in particular, you'll know that what I learned that day is that when a younger sibling asks a question that the older sibling thinks he or she knows the answer to, and the parent is there ready to be impressed, the older sibling is just going to bust out some shit, right? So now the older sibling was ready. She, even before I could say anything, it's like the 12-year-old was just waiting for this moment. And the 12-year-old, whose name is Ashton, she says, "Redlining," which is scary accurate for those who know the history. And for those who don't, you're about to know. I don't even know where she got this word from. Maybe I mumbled it in my sleep. It's possible. I do anti-racism work, but it still freaked me out a little bit. The 10-year-old said, "Yeah, I don't know what redlining means." I said, "Yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off." But then we proceeded to have a 4-minute discussion about this concept. What Ashton was speaking to was very accurate, right? The reality is the reason certain neighborhoods look the way that they do, both economically and racially, is not an accident. There are no accidents, just precedents. Remember that. Just things that precede what you see right now. And what my daughter was saying was, and she was right, even though she didn't maybe know the depth of the history, that this thing called redlining and a broader issue of housing discrimination is what had caused this. For those who don't know the term, redlining is a thing that used to happen legally. It wasn't even made illegal until 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And even after that, it continued informally. And even today, the estimates are there are at least 2 million, maybe as many as 4 million cases of race-based housing discrimination against people of color every year. But back in the day, it was thoroughly legal. And what banks used to do was they would put maps on the wall, and they would take red markers, and they would essentially draw a line around every black community. And anybody who lived in the boundaries of that community was not going to be able to get a loan. You weren't going to be able to get a mortgage loan for a house. You weren't going to be able to get a business loan to start a business. You weren't going to be able to get an equity loan to expand your house if you already had one. You were going to be cut off from credit and capital, right? And as a result of that, those neighborhoods not only remained racially isolated, but they remained economically marginalized because people didn't have access to wealth. This was happening at the same time, I explained to my daughters, that the government was subsidizing white flight. Because keep in mind, public housing, like the projects we were driving through, was created for white people. Let me repeat that because we don't learn that history. Public housing was created for white people. In fact, in the earliest years of its existence, people of color were not allowed to live in it. That's how racist it was. Even the poorest public housing was for white folks. But beginning in the late 30s and then throughout the 40s and 50s, the government created and expanded various programs that allowed white folks to hustle it out of the cities into the suburbs, into smaller towns and exurbs, right, with FHA loans, VA loans, GI Bill benefits, $120 billion of housing equity loaned preferentially to white people between 1934 and 1962 just on the basis of the FHA program. $120 billion in guaranteed underwritten government loans, government-backed loans. If we had done that for black folks, we'd have called that welfare. We'd have called that affirmative action. We did it for white people. We called it good macroeconomic policy and ignored the racial component of it. Right? So white folks were being paid, in a sense, to leave the city. Black and brown folks being trapped in the city, denied capital. That is why the neighborhood looks the way it does. Why is that important for me to explain to my daughters? And why is it important for them to know? And why is it important for you to know? Well, if we remain oblivious to the context that brought us to the place we are now, in terms of inequality, what do you think the 10-year-old child, if she doesn't get the context, because maybe her parents don't know the answer, or maybe she just never asks the question because she doesn't know how to ask it, or colorblindness as a mentality tells us we're not supposed to notice that the neighborhood's black, you know. You're not supposed to notice that. Like the black folks there don't know they're black, right? Like that's funny thing, white folks never want to acknowledge someone's racial identity like they don't know their racial identity. Like, oh, well, they're not black. I don't even see color. What the hell's wrong with you? Like, they know they're black, like, and they ain't sweating it. Like, they know and they're cool with it. You're the only one freaking out, right? So a lot of kids don't ask. A lot of parents don't know the answer. And so what do you think my 10-year-old does? If she doesn't ask or I don't know the answer, do you think she stops wondering? No, she's going to keep wondering, isn't she? But she's going to come up with her own answer. And what's the only answer she can possibly have? Well, it's the one that this country tells her, right? The default position of this country is wherever you end up is all about you. The default position of this country is if you work hard, you can be anything. If you didn't make it, it's because you didn't work hard enough. So if you got folks living in a poor neighborhood, it must be because they're lazy. They didn't work hard enough. There's no context. There's no sociological imagination. It's just they should have worked harder. And the people who are rich and live over here in the quote-unquote nicer neighborhood, they just must be brilliant because, you know, if you're rich, you must be brilliant. You got lots of money. You must be smart. Even if you only got your money by inheriting $200 million of real estate assets from your daddy. You must be a genius. $200 million in real estate assets that you inherited from your dad, and you still went bankrupt 5 times. How the hell does that happen? I used to get $5 a week from my grandmother. I ain't declared bankruptcy once, y'all, but somebody gets $200 million from their daddy, and they're like, I did it 3 times, I think I'll do it again. Did it 4 times, I think I'll do it again. Just had one of his casinos go broke on yesterday. So how in the hell does that happen? That's not even part of the speech, but I just felt like saying it. Because we have a mentality that says rich people are rich because they're brilliant. Really, there are 37 people in this country who have the same collective net worth as the bottom half of this country. 37 people. Donald Trump isn't even close to them, by the way, not even remotely close. 37 people that have the same net worth as the bottom 165 million Americans. Do we really think there are 37 people that are just that much smarter than the rest of us that have worked that much harder? Like, they're only 24 hours in a day, yo. So what do? Like, do they have a wormhole that they go hide in, and then they get like 100 hours a day, and then they shoot out the back of the wormhole, and that's why they got all this work done? The hell do we think is going on? The 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, 5 of whom were born into the family, 1 of whom married in. 6 people have the same collective net worth as the poorest 40% of Americans, 130 million Americans. You think the 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, just because their last name is Walton, but you think they got all the IQ points? You think that they work that much harder than the rest? It's got nothing to do with merit or ability. It has to do with the system that is rigged from the jump against the vast majority of Americans, including, I dare to remind you, the vast majority of white folks. And yet, we've got these white folks who act like they got more in common with those 37 people. They got more in common with those 6 people named Walton. They got more in common with Donald J. Trump than they have in common with the black and brown folks who they want to control and dominate. Now, isn't that interesting? Because it strikes me that that's some foolish shit right there. If you think you actually have more in common with the wealthy than with other working class people, you are not paying attention. But see, that's the other part of our history we don't learn, and that's what allows us to be oblivious. We don't learn that this is all one big trick. And it is one hell of a con that rich people have been playing on the vast majority of us. See, when somebody who's rich tells people who are not rich that their problem is other poor people, A, they're lying, and B, they're not original. This stuff we're hearing play out right now, this isn't new. This has been the whole history of America. If you want to actually understand the history of this country in terms of race and class, I can sum it up in one phrase. The history of this country is the history of rich white men telling very much not rich white people that their problem are black and brown people. That is the whole history of America. The rest is commentary, right? And by that I mean, if you go back to the colonial period, this stuff's been going on forever, right? You have rich white folks, not even called white yet. That's how deep it gets. Because white is some new shit. See, a lot of times we don't believe that. We think the white race is this long-standing thing with this proud history. It's crazy, right? There's no such thing as the white race. Putting aside the science of it, there's no such thing even culturally and historically. There was no white race in Europe. The hell, we spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't think of ourselves as one big happy family. The Irish hated the English hated the Irish, Northern Italians didn't even think Southern Italians were Italians, right? And a lot of other Europeans didn't think any Italians were European, and there's always been this division. We weren't one team, but all of a sudden, see, Europeans come to the colonies, and what do you have? You got a handful of rich folks that own all the stuff, and you got a bunch of indentured servant European poor peasants without anything, and African enslaved folks and indigenous people who combined outnumber your ass. Now, if you're rich and you own all the stuff and you're outnumbered 5-1 by poor people who sort of eventually are going to figure out the game, right? Like eventually these poor folks are going to be like, what the hell's going on? And why don't we jack their stuff? Like, they're taking advantage of all of us. They're enslaving you. They're indenturing us. They're stealing your land. Why don't we get together and figure this shit out and come up with a different system? And eventually there were rebellions that suggested some people were starting to figure that out. Bacon's Rebellion was one example. There were others where working class people put aside whatever differences might have existed culturally or in terms of national origin, certainly other than skin color, and said, this is a game, this is a con, we need to change this. But then the rich were like, oh, hell no, we can't have that. We got to broaden our team. We got to make our bench deeper, you know, because eventually we're going to lose our stuff. So what they did is they create the white race. They start using that term. That term was not used in Europe. That term was not common. In Shakespearean literature, actually, white was often used to denote people that were weak and diseased. It wasn't actually thought of as some positive thing, let alone some like pan-European concept to bring all European people together. So all of a sudden they start using this term to justify what? Dividing and conquering working people. Because if they can get the indentured servant Europeans to think that they got more in common with the rich, then they'll stop joining with the black folks. They certainly will stop running away to join indigenous communities, which many white folks did in the earliest days of the colonies. On pain of death, in fact, I should point out, they did this because they believed that those communities were freer than the ones that they were being exposed to that were European-derived, right? So in order to divide and conquer, what they did was they create this thing called the white race. They say, by the way, all of you who are now called white, we're going to give you certain perks, not much, because we don't like you that much, but we're going to let you own a little land if you're male and own a little land. We're going to let you vote. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And most importantly, we're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line. So now what you did is you gave a badge and a gun and a horse to some now called white person who didn't have a pot to piss in. Now they think they have some authority. Now they've just received what W.E.B. Du Bois would call a couple hundred years later the psychological wage of whiteness, right? I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. I might not have much, but at least I'm not Mexican. I might not have much, but at least I'm not indigenous. I might not have much, but at least I'm not Chinese American working on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. Thousands of Chinese American folks brought here oftentimes really quite against their will and worked to death on those railroads. At least I'm not them, right? And all of a sudden those rebellions start to stop because you've given just enough perks to the white folks. And think about how that worked all through history. Think about how this game has worked. Fast forward to the Civil War. You got rich white people in my part of the country. I'm from the South, been in the South all my life. Rich white folks who back in the day, man, we weren't ashamed of why we broke away from the Union. We were real clear. We lie about it now. Oh, we say, oh, it had nothing to do with slavery. No, it was about states' rights. Okay, what states' right do you think they were fighting for? Like, do you think they were arguing over the right to determine the best mint julep recipe or the best way to smoke a pork butt? Like, what the hell you think they were arguing over? The only right they were really disputing was the right to own other human beings within their state. And they were clear about it. The vice president of the Confederacy admitted it because he had no shame. He said the cornerstone of our new government is the great truth that the Negro is not the equal to the white man. In other words, white supremacy was the cornerstone of their government. It was their entire reason for breaking away and being willing to sacrifice the lives of hundreds of thousands of people for that cause. But now ask yourself, do you think rich people wanted to go fight that war to maintain their own property interest in other human beings? Hell no, because rich people don't fight to protect their own shit. They get poor people to do that. Some things have not changed. Rich people don't go to war to protect anything. Rich people claim they have heel spurs and can't go to war and get other people to go to war for them. If you don't know the reference, Google that shit. So the rich in the South told the poor in the South, y'all need to go and fight to protect our way of life. Our way of life? Whose way of life? Poor folks didn't own anybody. Poor folks didn't even own the shirt on their back for all intent and purpose. So how, if you're rich, do you get poor people to go fight for your stuff? That's a hell of a trick, because I got a nice house. But here's the thing. If an army were to invade my block next week, I doubt very seriously that I could rely on any of y'all to come fight to protect my shit. I don't think I could call y'all up and be like, hey, there's an army down the block. I don't feel like putting up much of a fight. I'm going to sit on the back porch and have a drink, but I need y'all to come and protect my shit. You'd be like, no. But rich people said that to poor Southerners, and they were like, oh, yeah. Why? Well, because the rich said, oh, these black people get free, they're going to take your job. No, fool, they got your job. Don't you understand? If the enslaved person can be made to work for free, and you have to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, guess who got the gig, Jack? Not you. The free labor got the gig. That's how that works, basic econ. So in fact, most poor European descended so-called white people would have been better off joining with black people to overthrow the system of white supremacy, but they got conned by the psychological wage of whiteness. Fast forward to the union movement, where you had white labor leaders who were so sucked into that mentality by the 1930s that they would not integrate their unions. And when you ask them why, they would say, well, if we integrate our union, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, it'll double the size of your union. And then when you go out on strike, that might actually help you, right? You'll be more likely to win whatever struggle you're in, because if you don't bring these folks into the union and then you go on strike, that's who the boss is going to replace your ass with, or the very people that you didn't want to have working side by side with you, see? So solidarity would have been better for everyone, except those perhaps at the very top, who I'm not much concerned about. They can take care of themselves. But the vast majority of people would have been better off with a politic of solidarity. And that's still what we're hearing today when it comes to immigration. We got folks that want you to believe that if we just build a wall, but not just any wall, a wall like you wouldn't believe, it's going to be a fabulous, spectacular wall like you've never seen before. What the hell does that even mean? What the hell is a wall that I wouldn't believe? Like, I've seen a lot of walls. I'll believe most walls, unless it's like a butter wall. Is that what he means? Like a big, beautiful butter wall? Because if that's it, I don't believe that shit. Like, I think that'll melt. I'm fairly confident. But any other wall, I'd pretty much believe. But people want to believe that if you just build a wall and deport 11 million people, all of a sudden manufacturing jobs are going to come back to this country. For real? Do you think that the wall is going to stop capital from moving their money across borders? Because I don't see how that works, see? See, trade isn't just about workers, it's about capital, and nothing about these proposals will prevent capital from leaving. The wall's not going to stop people from putting their money in Cayman Island bank accounts so they don't have to pay taxes on their profits. It's not going to keep them from moving the plant to Sri Lanka to take advantage of lower wages, lack of environmental protection, no labor laws. Right? It's not like the wall's going to stop when they try to transfer $1 billion. It's like, boop, oh, shit, the wall. Oh, shit. You know? The wall only stops workers. Now, this is basic econ as well. If you have an economic system that allows capital to traverse borders in search of the highest return and allows goods to cross borders in search of the highest price, but you chain labor to its country of origin, by definition, you have tilted the game forever in favor of capital and against workers. That is basic econ. Right? You cannot have a system that allows capital and goods to move and not workers to move. That's not good for any workers, not just the folks in the global south. In the long run, that's not even good for people in the global north. Now, we may need to have a different trade system. I very much believe that we need to have a different trade system with labor protections and environmental protections in place, not only in this country but around the world. But that's a very different conversation than one that says those people are jacking your jobs, they are taking your opportunities, and if we can just stop them, everything will be fine. It's a lie. It's divide and conquer. It is trying to get working class white folks and black folks and brown folks to fight one another, taking their eye off the ball, which is those 37 people who own half or own as much as the bottom half of this country. That 1/10 or 1/100th of 1% that own the same as the bottom 90% of the American population. That is the bigger problem. We all are being played for fools by those who would engage this politics of scapegoating. And it's not our fault for not knowing that, but it's sure as hell our fault for figuring out what we're going to do in the face of it. Because, see, at the end of the day, if we don't figure this out pretty quick, we're going to be in a world of hurt. We got about 30 years until this country's going to be half people of color and half white. That's a fact. No wall is going to prevent that, by the way, even if it got built. And it's not going to get built, right? It wouldn't get built even if Donald Trump won, because there's not enough money to build this damn thing. Anybody who thinks otherwise has never actually been to the southern border. And I should point out, it's only the southern border, isn't it, that we want to build the wall with. We apparently are not worried about crafty Canadians sneaking into our country to take advantage of our superior health care system. The Minutemen don't hang out off the coast of Nova Scotia with guns just in case some crafty folks from Halifax decide to sneak in. It's only these people, but remember, it's not about race. No. We don't mind them coming. That's what we hear. We just want them to come the right way, like our ancestors. What the hell does that mean? Come the right way, like our ancestors, like the Europeans, like the right way, like that? First of all, here's the problem with that argument. I mean, there are lots of problems with it, and we probably should ask some indigenous people what the biggest ones are, but here's another problem with it. When our people came, there were no laws in place to keep us from coming. So when your family didn't break a law that didn't even exist yet, they don't get patted on the back for their law-abidingness, right? When your great whatever comes here and didn't break a law and you think, well, that makes them law-abiding. No, there was no law in place to violate, because the very first law that the Congress passed after the ratification of the Constitution was this thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what did it say? It said all free white persons and only free white persons can be citizens of the United States. So, done, you see? There was no law. So the fact that you came legally the right way, there were no other options. You really think your ancestors wouldn't have come had it been against the law? Do you really believe that? Because I can tell you about my own ancestors. If Scotland had been right next to the United States, if England had been right next to the United States, if Russia had been right next to the United States, so that getting here, would have been relatively easy from a physical perspective as opposed to a long boat trip, I guarantee you that my ancestors would have come because they were desperate. As James Baldwin said, European folks, quote-unquote white folks, came here because we were desperate and we were starving and we couldn't make it. But we don't want to accept that narrative because we bought into a narrative that is this fictive belief that our people came for principle. These Mexicans, they're just coming for stuff. But our people came for principles like liberty and democracy. Our people didn't come for liberty and democracy. If they'd come for that, they would have established that. But in the colonial period, our people were spending most of that time trying to figure out who the biggest witch was. Right? We didn't believe in liberty. We're like, you're a witch. Well, you're a warlock. Well, you're a witch. We're going to burn you. That's not freedom, liberty, democracy. That's some wacky stuff. That's the opposite of those words. Right? We didn't come for principle. You know what? We came for stuff. Because our people were the losers of Europe. I mean no disrespect. I'm just trying to keep things as real as possible. Our people were the losers of Europe. And there's no dishonor in that. I'm not trying to be harsh by saying it. I'm just saying, because it's important, though. It's important to know. Because if you believe that we were the winners, then you can look down on people who were the quote-unquote losers of their societies who have to leave because they're not able to make it there. But we were the losers of Europe. You do realize, I hope you realize that, like, the winners didn't get on the boat, right? Because if you were winning, why the hell would you risk that shit? Like, if you were winning, you wouldn't be like, oh, screw it. I mean, we've got all this property and all this gold. And like every Friday night, we have dinner at the king's house and shit, and it's awesome. And, children gather around. Daddy has a plan. It's going to sound a bit odd, I must admit, because we got all this stuff, and it's brilliant, right? It's great, right? I know it's great. But here's the thing. I think our life has gotten too predictable. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a couple of weeks to gather up your things, not much. Just a few things, enough to put in a knapsack or whatever the hell we have in England in 1647. And we're going to get on a boat, a rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy, to be honest with you. Like it might sink. We might get hijacked by pirates. We might get scurvy. We might drown and be eaten by sharks. But children, assuming that we survive, I think we will all be able to say at the end of the year that it was quite an adventure. Okay, that shit never happened. The winners didn't get on the boat. The losers got on the boat because they were desperate. And if we could just admit that we were desperate and had no choice, then maybe we could see ourselves in those who come here now for the same reason, and we could see them in us. But it's holding on to this fictional narrative, right, that allows us to not see it. So part of this task is for us to be prepared to question everything that we've been taught about who we are and who we've been and where we're headed as a people, because I, for one, think we're capable of a lot better than this. And it's interesting to me how sometimes when you say the stuff that I say, right, the operative argument that comes from people on the right, and even from some people that aren't on the right, who just aren't as far on the left as I am, well, you hate America and you're unpatriotic, whatever that word even means. I don't know what that means, because I have to tell you the truth. I think when it comes to something like patriotism, if you think that patriotism involves crossing your heart while reciting words that you learned in kindergarten during a football game, you clearly have a flawed understanding of what this word means. That's not patriotism. That's not love of country. That's hyper-nationalism. It has nothing to do with anything. The most patriotic thing that a person can do is to take a knee or to take a seat and protest those who would deny the words of the Constitution of the United States. Because the Constitution is what people have fought and died for. Anyone who has a problem with those who critique America, whether it's for police violence or other forms of inequality, and says, well, soldiers have died for that flag. No soldier ever died for a flag. And how dare we disregard and dismiss the memories of those who have died by saying that that's what they were fighting for. Soldiers took an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Not a piece of fabric, not a pledge, not a national anthem, the Constitution. And if the constitutional guarantees of due process and equal protection are being violated, then every patriot ought to take a knee until that stops. Every patriot ought to take a seat until that stops. That is what people who really love the principles of the country, not just the symbols of the country, the principles of the country ought to do. But we have a hard time with that, and people say, well, you hate America. Well, here's the thing. I find it very interesting that those of us who critique this country are the one, and not just critique it, but who insist that it can be better. We're the ones who get branded America-hating. We're the ones who get branded as unpatriotic. We're the ones who were told that we don't love the country. Now, what's more cynical? What's more hateful? Insisting that we can do better and be better and live up to the principles that we espouse? Or saying, you know what, it's as good as it gets, and in fact, right now we sort of suck. We need to go back 50 years. What's more cynical? What's more hateful? What's more unpatriotic? Saying that we can do better, or saying, well, you know, people of color twice as likely to be out of work. Oh, well, I guess it's the best we can do. People of color 3 times as likely to be poor. Oh, well, I guess it's as good as we can do. People of color 1/15 the net worth of white folks. Oh, well, I guess it's as good as we can do. Black and brown folks, 9 years less life expectancy. Oh, well, I guess it's the best we can do. Double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children. Oh, well, I guess it's the best we can do. I dare say that the people who would suggest that we can't do better than that, they are the ones who in fact hate the country. They are the ones who have sold out the people of the country. They are the ones who do not believe in the spirit of this country. And unless they are routed from political life and replaced by those who believe in multiracial democracy, this country will not survive. That is your job. That is my job. I thank you for being here tonight, and I appreciate you very much. Take care. Thank you. So we have mics over here, we will start with that. I want to say thank you all for hanging out. I know some folks may have to go. One quick thing, if you're leaving, if you can just do that with the least amount of volume until you get out in the hall, maybe not talk until you get out there, and then you could do whatever. But I just want to make sure we can get into the Q&A, get the folks who have a question to get their question asked. I'll answer it. We'll move through it. Thank you all so much for hanging out. I know it's been a long night, and I appreciate you for being here. So we'll start over on this side, then we'll come over on this side, and then we can, and by the way, if you're someone who is not physically able to come to a mic, I get it, that's fine. Or if you're just one of those people that's really like maybe shy about getting up in front of people and asking a question, that's understandable too. So if you're one of those people and you want to raise a hand, I'll come to you after I take some of the mic folks. So I'll come over here first, then I'll come to you. Then if there's somebody like that out there, I'll come to you. If not, we'll just go back and forth. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Laverne Bitsy Baldwin in Shia, Kia Ani and Shluj Kurich Eatney Bushichin, Twahachin, New Mexico. It's my formal introduction in Dene. That's who I am. What I do is, my name's Laverne Bitsy Baldwin. I'm director for the Multicultural Engineering Program. And I want to just give you some truth back to you and then ask you a question. Mm-hmm. So those words really hit me. This country is asking us to adopt cultural amnesia.
Yeah.
That was powerful. But I want to tell you, we can help you because as indigenous people, we already live in a post-apocalyptic reality. And there's no doubt about it. So talk to any Native person. Find out a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
But what I want to know is, what are the systems and the culture connected to retaining mascots like Indians and Braves?
I think that it's part of a culture of white supremacy, particularly symbolic white supremacy. And by that I mean a kind that replicates itself via images, via symbols. There have been lots of these kinds of symbols over the years. Indigenous mascots are one example. Blackface is another example. There's lots of examples we can think of where the work of white supremacy was done less with words or overt violence than with these symbols of marginalization. So blackface, which of course, I know has been an issue here on the campus recently with one particular incident, was historically used to denigrate people of color. It was not an innocent thing. And mascots and the symbolic representation of indigeneity has usually been, at the very least, about marginalizing the feelings of indigenous people, at the very most, about sort of openly mocking the humanity of indigenous people. And so I think it's all part of that. Now, that doesn't mean that every person who finds themselves okay with mascots is an overt white supremacist by any stretch. I think the thing about symbolic white supremacy is how pervasive it is, that it seeps into our everyday reality and we don't think about it. And the reality is, just like I was saying before, if you haven't been taught what's problematic about indigenous mascots or about blackface or about any of those symbols, then really decent people can make the mistake of falling into those tropes and those traps. But I think it's rather obvious that none of these symbols were created by indigenous peoples, first of all. They did not have the power to choose those mascots in virtually any case. And they are not the ones who ultimately get the final say. As we were talking earlier before the speech tonight, I have no problem with the idea of putting the issue of mascots to a vote. But the only people who should be able to vote are indigenous people, right? If indigenous people actually think that that honors them, then they can say that with a vote. That's for indigenous people to decide. For any of the rest of us to weigh in on that when we have no skin in the game and no price to pay seems absurd. But you know what? None of the folks who defend indigenous mascots are willing to put it to a native-only plebiscite. Not one. They are not willing to do that, and I know why. Because at the end of the day, we really don't believe that indigenous people have the right to determine their own reality. That's why we took the land. That's why we mine uranium on land that causes reproductive organ cancer among Navajo peoples to be 17 times the rate of the national average. Because at the end of the day, we don't really see, still after all these years, indigenous people as fully human. We see them as caricatures and cartoons and people to serve as forms of entertainment for us. And so I think that is part of the culture. That doesn't mean, again, that anybody who defends the mascot's a horrible human being, but it does mean that we're lacking in a certain fundamental understanding of what these images do and how, and we just wouldn't accept it with regard to a lot of other groups. We just wouldn't. We wouldn't accept it anymore with regard to African American folks having mascots that were as cartoonish and buffoonish as we use for indigenous people. We wouldn't allow it for Jewish folks. We wouldn't allow it for, most any quote-unquote minority, but with indigenous people, because they're approximately 1.75, 2.25% of the American population, I guess we figure we can get away with it. But I think we really need to rethink it, and I think those of us who care about issues of equity ought to be prepared to say, at the very least, let indigenous people decide and take ourselves out of it. At the very most, we have to stand in solidarity with those who were saying this is problematic. And it won't do to say, oh, there are some Native people who were cool with it. I remember being at the University of Illinois for a speech several years ago, and that kind of stuff was being said because it was when Chief Alinowick was being run out finally of the institution. Folks were saying, well, I know some Native people who were down with it or whatever. It's like, well, okay, you know a couple of Native people who were okay with it, but the broad swath of indigenous people in and around Champaign-Urbana have been against it for a really long time and have been talking about it. And this was a mascot that wasn't created. It doesn't even fit Illini people. Like if you ever saw Chief Alinowick, he would come out halftime with like a big headdress, which was Plains Indians, which is not at all what they were. It wasn't even genuine. It was an image created by Boy Scouts in 1913 in Champaign-Urbana, and the dance was not a fancy dance. It was a Boy Scout gymnastics routine. Had nothing to do with indigenous people, but they kept calling it this authentic Native representation. This is what's so sad. If you want to honor Native people, then create scholarships for indigenous people. You want to honor Native people, then create an indigenous peoples department of study at the college. You want to honor indigenous people. You want to honor indigenous people, stop mining all that uranium on their land. You want to honor indigenous people, end the racism and brutality that is posed against them, both economically and law enforcement, because indeed indigenous people per capita have the highest rate of being killed by law enforcement of any group in this country. There are lots of ways to honor indigenous people that got nothing to do with your ball game. That much I know. Exactly. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
I'm a student of history and political science here at the university, so my question relates to the law.
Okay.
In a country absent of explicitly racist legislation, how can we force a more equitable culture without treating colored people as a protected class?
Well, I think, first of all, people of color by definition are any group that has been historically marginalized, or any category. Actually, it's not even any group. It's any category which has been the basis of invidious discrimination. By definition under law, is protected because we have a history that speaks to the need for that. So it's not just people of color. Indeed, white folks, if white folks are targeted or discriminated against on the basis of race, that is protected as well by civil rights law. If women are targeted as women or if men are targeted as men, it's protected as civil rights law. So race, gender, increasingly sexuality, but not quite at the same level yet legally. So we have protected classes based on a recognition that these have been the bases of invidious discrimination. And it's just meant as a precaution to say, hey, we know we've been down this road before, so we need to make real damn sure we're not going down that road again. So there's no way, and nor do I think a reason why we would want to prevent that. We would want to always ensure that our policies and our practices and our procedures are not having the effect of remarginalizing people on the basis of those kinds of categories. Now, we might disagree about, and many of us could have excellent discussions and debates about, okay, well, how do we do that? What is the proper way to ensure that? What are the policies that we can have, or what should we not have? That's an interesting and a valid discussion. But I think we will always have a need for law which recognizes that those have been the categories that have made the difference. Those have been the dividing lines historically. And to act as if, they don't matter anymore because the law changed would make very little sense. It would be like, saying, well, we have laws against murder, we have laws against theft, we have laws against rape and sexual assault, so we don't need to actually pay attention to whether those things are happening, or we don't need to have certain preventative measures to reduce the likelihood of them happening. I think we need to have preventive measures. What does that mean? Well, for me, what it means, and this is a discussion of jurisprudence that, again, good, honest people can disagree about. Right now, jurisprudence sort of bounces around. When conservatives are ascendant on the court, they have limited the jurisprudence in terms of what constitutes discrimination and what doesn't. what can be allowed versus what can't be allowed. When liberals are ascendant in the court, that changes, and it's changed a lot. It's changed from the 1880s all the way to the present. You can go back to the 1880s, and interestingly, that's 20 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, less than 20 after the end of the Civil War. There had been civil rights laws passed, and those civil rights laws sought to provide some opportunity to people who had been recently enslaved. And in 1883, the Supreme Court junked all of those laws and did so while Justice Bradley, who wrote the opinion for the court, said, in his words, it was time for the Negro to stop being the special favorite of the law and take his place as a mere citizen. Now, that's a fascinating comment for someone to make in 1883, to say that somehow black people were getting too much good stuff and they need to just be like the rest of us. In other words, it was a jurisprudence of colorblindness that was also history blind. It was saying, forget all that stuff that's been happening, just go run the race. That whole reverse discrimination notion that we hear today actually has its origins in 1883. Again, it's not new. Now, in the 1950s, that changes. And all of a sudden, you have the court, with Brown v. Board saying, actually, we have to take aim at the vestiges of slavery, even if it's not real enslavement. We have to take aim at segregation because it scars the minds of children, et cetera, using social science to make their argument. You have the court in 1971 saying that even employment policies that have the effect of hurting people of color, even if it's not intentional, can still be considered illegal in certain cases. Later on, in the late 80s, the conservative court moves backward on that and says, no, you have to be able to prove intent more so than that. There's been an up and down. I happen to be of the opinion that we need to look at not just the intent, but also the outcomes of laws, especially when it's predictable. There's so many things, if you think about it, that happen in our society that perpetuate inequality, that may not be deliberate, but which we really ought to be concerned about. For instance, if you have a school system that relies upon standardized testing to determine who's going to get into college and who's not, who's going to go to this school versus that school, and you impose that standardized testing on profoundly unstandardized students who had unstandardized K-12 opportunities, unstandardized backgrounds, unstandardized curriculum, you are clearly going to create an unequal system. And we know the data says it's going to be unequal on the basis of race, and it's going to be unequal on the basis of class. It seems to me, even though it may not be intentional, the effect of that is to perpetuate racial inequality, economic inequality, which isn't technically illegal, but it's connected to racial inequality. And we might want to rethink that. Similarly, in the job market, most jobs, right, are filled through networking, old boys network, who you know, not what you know. The courts have said that's not illegal, and I understand you probably can't make it illegal. It wouldn't be practical to. But we as a society ought to think about it, because if half the jobs are being filled that way, and that's what the latest research says, who's going to be left out from those networks? Well, disproportionately, it'll be people of color, it'll be women of all colors, and it'll be working class people of all races, including working class white folks, who might not know the right people, didn't go to the quote-unquote right schools, didn't belong to the right club, don't play golf with the right people, whatever. And as a result, they're scratched from opportunity, even if they're the best person. You could be a working class white guy, best person for the next job, but if you don't know Jim over in the accounting department, you're screwed, right? Or you could be Mary, and you might be the best person. You could be a white woman, best person for the job, but you don't know John over in the HR department, you're screwed. So we need to think about discrimination, not only in the legal sense, and try to open up what is actionable in court and what isn't, but also in a moral sense, and think about how do we create policies that get at those indirect, informal, sometimes very subtle, but still very serious ways in which people are denied opportunity. And some of that stuff you can't do through law. Some of it you have to encourage employers to think about. So in my book, Colorblind, which I know was mentioned, you mentioned, one of the things that I do in there is I say, look, we can't just wait around for the state to handle these things. If I'm an employer, I want to be conscious of that on my own. I want to choose to be conscious of how color and gender and class affect what I see when people send me those resumes. Yeah, some people look better on paper because they've had more opportunity, but I can't reward them for looking better on paper if the reason is they had a 3-lap head start in a 5-lap race. Like if I have a 3-lap head start in a 5-lap race, I should hit the tape first. That's how races work. But if I start out with a 3-lap head start and I end up with only a 2-lap lead, then maybe the person who gained ground on me is actually more qualified. As an employer, I want to think about that, not only for the sake of fairness, but for the sake of my company, right? I might actually be overlooking the most qualified person by using traditional standards. And so I just want us to all think more capaciously about what equity requires, a lot of which the government can't do, a lot of which the government won't be able to impose, but which we as individuals in our private capacity certainly can. So I would just want us to think, as broadly as we can about those. I appreciate the question, though. Thank you. Yes?
First, I want to thank you for bringing a little bit of Southern realness. I'm originally from Georgia, so I appreciate hearing that. My name is April Patillo. I teach in the American Ethnic Studies department here, and even though I present as an African American woman, my focus is usually indigenous and native law and policy, as well as talking about the solidarities and the connections.
Sure.
So as I stand in my classroom as an African American woman, I know every time I say people of color and or difference, what people hear is black women.
Right.
Okay? I also, for that reason, one of the main questions in almost every class has to do with what's the difference between an ally and a social justice accomplice.
Right.
Now, I have my definition from lived experience and what I do every day.
Yeah.
But I refuse to give students an answer to that. They have to work that out for themselves.
Right.
So if you will humor me, how would you define that, and what does that look like?
Well, I prefer the concept of accomplice and even co-conspirator. The only problem with those terms, because here's the thing about terminology, it's always fraught with issues. Ally is fraught with issues, and I'll discuss what I think those are in a second. But even co-conspirator or accomplice are problematic because they both imply something criminal, right? To be an accomplice or a co-conspirator usually is looked at as this pejorative criminal thing, and we ought not be criminalizing ourselves in terms of our identity. But the concept I like better, because the problem with an ally, when you're an ally, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way, because I think we can think about, for instance, in World War II, the Allied forces all had a similar stake in the outcome of that war. So it wasn't like, oh, we're just fighting on behalf of you. Like, people were all fighting for their own stake in it. But I think sometimes the concept of ally can easily devolve, at least in the way that the ally, him or herself, thinks of it, as a struggle of someone else that they are joining. And the problem with that, practically, is that it removes any sense of your own stake in eradicating the system. Whereas the notion of solidarity, the notion of co-conspiracy, the notion of accomplice suggests we both are in this and we both have a stake in this. Now, again, this is somewhat semantic. I'm not saying that if somebody out there likes to call themselves an ally, it's a bad thing. I just want us to think about what do we mean, because I do think sometimes the problem with quote-unquote white allies is that we get involved in this struggle, and it's like, I'm joining the struggle for black people or for brown people or whatever, rather than seeing the end of white supremacy as deeply implicated in my own survival, both physical, emotional, spiritual, and in every other way. And I think if I see it as my own struggle, I'm not just an ally, I am an accomplice, I am a co-conspirator, I am someone who engages in solidarity with people of color, because I realize that even though they're the first target of that system, that I'm the collateral damage of that system. And so my preference is for a deeper word. I'm not sure that any of these words are great, and I think it's a fine conversation to have. Of course, at the end of the day, the issue is ally, co-conspirator, accomplice, whatever it is, it has to be a verb, not a noun. So whatever it is we call it, the question is, are we doing it? And if we're doing it, I don't much care what we call it. Like, if we're out there fighting the fight, I don't think anybody's going to really sweat the terms. I think the issue is, what does it mean in terms of our commitment? And if we're really engaged in solidaristic action with the marginalized on behalf not only of their community but our own, then I think we'll know it, everyone else will know it, and it'll be really hard to ignore. Yeah.
Thank you for being an accomplice.
You bet. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Hello. My name is Brian Davis. I'm a junior here, president of the Black Student Union. One of the key points of your talk, you said, we haven't taken the class yet. Our theme this year is Unapologetically Black, Building Leaders and Continuing Knowledge. And through continuing knowledge, we're working on a document that proposes the need for increased need-based scholarships, the need for a multicultural student center, and the key point that I wanted to ask you a question about was the need for a required cultural competency course. Do you think the goal for a required cultural competency course is, one, feasible, and what is its potential, and and how should we go about doing that?
Well, it's certainly feasible. A required course of any type can be done. It's about the political will and the practical will of the leaders of an institution to make that happen, whether it's about cultural competence or any other issue. There are already a set of requirements that I imagine every student has to fulfill in order to graduate. So adding one more is not impossible. The question is really more about how and what it looks like. Because here's the thing. I've known of schools that had required courses, but, you can require a course in cultural competence, but what does that mean? What does that really mean, right? Because lots of times I've seen schools that require that, but they allow a very broad range of things to fulfill that requirement. So in other words, you might fulfill it by coming in your first year and taking a class in, race, power, and privilege. And I might fulfill it by taking a class in Brazilian dance. Now, by the way, I'm a Latin American Studies minor. I took a class on Brazilian dance. I think it's a great class to take. I'm not trying to demean it in any way. But I'm saying that if I took a class in Brazilian dance and you took a class in race, power, and privilege, we did not have the same learning. But if the requirement allows us both to get our requirement by doing that, and now you've got cultural competence and I've got cultural competence, we have a problem, right? We have to, in other words, narrow it quite a bit more and expect a little bit more rather than just calling it cultural competence. I would suggest that we really need to have a basic grounding in issues of inequality and equity in the 21st century, because at the end of the day, people coming out of an institution of higher learning in this country are going to have to figure out how to deal with these fundamental issues of inequity, not just racial, but economic inequity, some of which I talked about today, gender inequity, sexual inequity, religious inequity. Like, these are issues that are going to be in the coming decades among the most prominent issues in this country, if not the world. And so in order to be fully functional, we need everyone to have some grounding in that. Can that be done with one class? That's the next question. I'm not convinced of that. I think we ought to at least have one class that should be expected of all students, but I think we have to do more than that. I think we have to actually reach out and try to see how we can inculcate this frame of reference throughout departments. Because here's the problem. Right now, we all know this work tends to be handled by a handful of departments. And these are like the usual suspect departments. So sociology will talk about it. Poli-sci might talk about it. I'm a poli-sci major, and it's moved in a much more conservative, we want to be economists direction in the last 25 to 30 years. But some poli-sci profs talk about it. Anthropology, of course, women's studies, ethnic studies, et cetera. But for the most part, there are a lot of students who come through really great schools, get a really great education, but don't take classes in those areas, other than maybe a big survey class with 500 people in it at the beginning of their freshman year, which, may or may not take. So I think we really want to reach out and figure out, how do we bring this discussion about inequality into the spaces that maybe are not normally spaces for it? I think we could do that within science departments, because God knows the history of science has been one where supposedly very brilliant scientists have in fact used race and class as ways to demean, control, and even destroy other human beings. Genocide perpetrated not by the mob, but by science on behalf of scientific knowledge as it existed at that time. How important is it to understand that? See, I would think it's very important. I would think that if I know, and I'm thinking now, if I were a person of color and I knew the way that science had been used against my community, I might be much more inclined to think that that's a profession that I need to go into in order to see that that doesn't happen. We talk about how we're going to get people of color into STEM fields. Well, that's valuable. One of the ways might be to make it real clear how STEM fields and those kinds of things have been actually used against the very people who are not represented in them. That might be one incentive. So we need to be talking about that in science classes. We need math teachers to have an understanding of recent research, and there's been quite a bit of it in the last 10 to 15 years, about pedagogically how you can use concepts of equity and inequity and social justice to teach math concepts. A lot of times math teachers who are really good teachers otherwise, right, don't know about that because it's not their background. I get it. That's not what they studied. Most college profs are not pedagogical experts. They're content specialists, right? Usually high school teachers have pedagogical training. They went to teacher training school for that. They learned how to teach, not just what to teach. Most college profs are maybe brilliant at their area, but they didn't necessarily learn how to teach it. And so part of learning how is learning how are the different ways that you teach this subject matter to reach different populations who might come at it from a very different place. that takes some incentives. That takes the university being prepared to put up some money for that kind of training and for the creation of those kinds of courses. And it requires the institution to send a very clear message from the beginning that this is who we are. This is what our mission statement is. It's what our value and vision statement is. If you want to be a part of our institution, that's fantastic. We will expect you to be part of this mission. And I think if we do that, then whether it's one class or 3 classes or classes woven through all the different departments, then I think we can begin to make some real progress. But I certainly believe that before anyone should be able to graduate from any college or university in this country, they should certainly have to demonstrate some level of awareness. We don't have to agree on the issues. We certainly don't have to agree on the solutions. But if we don't at least have some basic agreement on the contours of the challenge ahead of us, which we will not have unless there are some courses and some coursework required, we're not preparing students for the world in which they will be deposited after graduation. So we have to do something, and it's up to you all to then get together and figure out what does that something look like. But something has to happen in that regard. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, yeah, I actually don't have a question, but more of like a challenge for the rest of you that are here. If you were really inspired by this speech and maybe want to be part of that progress, everyone here at these tables, has maybe a way that you could work towards that first step. So really, I encourage you to stop by and talk to all of us.
Absolutely.
And be part of that.
Yeah, please do that. Absolutely do that. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
So my name is Josh Robinson. I'm a sophomore here at K-State, majoring in accounting and finance. And I know this lecture was focusing on combating racism, but I have 2 specific questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, because much of the lecture referenced politics, I would like to ask this. I consider myself, like many others, socially liberal but fiscally conservative. I cannot stand Trump and his ridiculous policies. However, as someone who comes from a military family and will be serving myself in 2-3 years, I cannot support Hillary. So what advice would you give to college students when deciding on who to vote for?
Well, I think that whether it's college students or anyone else, I think we all have to make really hard choices about a lot of things. We have to make hard choices about what companies we're going to support who may or may not have good policies with regard to the environment or labor. We have to decide, whether we're going to drive a vehicle that contributes to ecological destruction at some level, or whether we're just going to ride our bike, and if we are going to drive, how much are we going to drive? Some people who are vegetarian make decisions about what food they're going to eat and what not, right? And so we all have compromises. We all do what's called harm reduction, right? Every one of us engages in harm reduction all the time. I mean, because no one can live a perfect life, right? Nobody can live always in tune with your principles. It's a nice goal, but we always make compromises. And some compromises are bigger than others. And for you, it may be a bridge too far, right, to vote for Hillary Clinton because of certain views you have on certain things, and it's a bridge too far for you to vote for Donald Trump for those same reasons. And it's not for me to tell you that you're wrong about those things, because your principles are your principles. I just want you to remember between now and the election and after the election, and for any of you in the room, that the idea that we can be these perfect moral actors on election day is almost always wrong. And when I was here 20 years ago and got a question about the election when it was between Clinton and Dole, I had my preference, but I was like, do what you want and do what fits your morality and your ethics. The only reason I'm a little less willing to say that now is because I think we're at a more dangerous point, and I do think that harm reduction in this particular instance is so important for me that I will have to, because I'm not a fan of Secretary Clinton, and I haven't been a fan of I wasn't a fan of Bill Clinton when he was president. I've never voted for a Clinton before, in fact. But I understand that just like we give out free needles to heroin addicts, knowing that that's not going to stop their addiction, but it might save a few lives because people won't get hepatitis or they won't get HIV or they won't get whatever. This is sort of one of those moments, at least for me. And for those who are just unable to do either of those things, then you have third-party candidates that you could potentially support, or you can feel free to not vote. The idea that everybody has to vote, if you really have a genuine moral problem with every candidate or a practical problem, then it's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to sit this one out. I've done that. I've done every possible thing. I've voted for third parties before. I've voted for Democrats. I've not voted. I haven't actually voted for a Republican for president, but I have in other elections. And because they happen to be, honestly, in a given situation, rare occasion, but on at least one, they happen to be less evil. I mean, it was actually in Tennessee a couple years ago. The guy that was a Democratic Party in my state is so jacked up that, like, there was this white supremacist that somehow got the nomination. So I happily voted for the Republican. It was no problem. But I think that, you know, we just want to always remember that when it comes to elections in particular, we are rarely going to get anyone that we just are super exuberant about, because our political system is so inclined towards producing either celebrity on the one hand or lifelong politicians on the other, each of whom have their own issues because of who they are and what they come from. And I think that it also is so bought into issues of money and who has it and who doesn't, that we're always talking about compromise. That's why at the end of the day, whatever you choose to do and whatever any of you choose to do on November 8th, the real issue, if you want to make the country great and make it a place good for everyone and great for everyone, is what you're doing the other 364 days. Because if what you're doing the other 364 days is aimed at justice and creating equity and creating a better country, then what happens on day 365 is still going to matter. But if everyone's doing what we need to be doing the other 364, what happens on day 365 is going to matter a lot less. On the other hand, if we're not doing what we need to be doing the other 364, whatever happens on day 365 isn't going to save us either. And so I just want us to think about that. You know, whatever you choose, hey, you know, I applaud you for making these hard moral decisions, whatever you choose to do. And I certainly, you know, hope that your service that you've just announced that you're going to be engaged in will be safe for you, and that you will come out of that with a renewed spirit towards making this place a really wonderful country for all, and I suspect you will. Whatever you choose on Election Day, I wouldn't judge you for it. And nor any of you. The question is, what are we going to do the rest of the year? And as long as we're doing that, I think we'll be all right. You bet. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
This next question might be kind of weird, and I just wanted you to know that I agree with you on pretty much all your stances, and I wouldn't be here at this lecture if I didn't.
Yeah.
So you talked about taking a knee for the flag, and you
Yeah.
also talked about people taking the test.
Yeah.
If you ask any person who served in the military, they will disagree with your stance on taking a knee during the national anthem. Why should I not see this as contradicting, seeing that you never served in the military?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, there are a lot of veterans, both serving now and ex-veterans, or ex-service persons, now veterans, who are actually in full agreement with Colin Kaepernick and the larger movement to take that knee. And so there are a lot of them. I mean, there was a whole hashtag created among folks in uniform still to this day who agree with it. Now, I agree with you. The vast majority don't feel that way, and I would never say that they did. But there are, in fact, plenty, and they're not all veterans of color, including white vets, who feel that way, who have said that they feel they not only fought for the right to do that, but that they, too, are concerned about the country that they're fighting for and want it to be better, as Kaepernick has said. Doesn't mean that his way is necessarily the best way. I happen to think there are a lot more ways to protest than just that. Just like the flag, that also is symbolic. So it doesn't solve the problem, and I would never suggest it does. But I think that the problem with the argument, or the implicit argument, it sounds to me like you're making, which is, if I haven't served in the military, that critique isn't valid. There comes a point where this argument sort of breaks down. And the reason it breaks down is the same reason that it breaks down when someone says, well, if you've never been a cop, you're not qualified to judge police brutality or the dangerous situations that cops face. Well, I've never been a heart surgeon, nor do I have any idea how to do open heart surgery. I am not qualified to do it, and God help you if you're relying on me and you need me for that, because you're going to die. But here's the thing. The fact that I've never been that job, the fact that I couldn't do that job and wouldn't choose to do that job, doesn't mean that I don't have a right to critique malpractice in that job, whether that's policing, whether that's doctors, or whether that's the military. And of course, there have been plenty of examples of war crimes committed by all soldiers in all countries, including our own, that have to be called out. The military sometimes is sent, and often, I would say too often, sent not for reasons that they themselves agree with, but for reasons that our leaders happen to send them for. And my biggest problem for those who serve isn't them. It's the fact that, I think they are told, and we are all told, that soldiers are going to fight for certain principles. And yet oftentimes when you really get down to it, too often, it isn't the principles that they're going to fight for. They're going to fight for something very different. After the Iraq War started, there was a poll that found something like 80% of American military believed that they had been sent, those in the war zone had been sent to avenge Saddam Hussein's role in 9/11. Well, Saddam Hussein had no role in 9/11, so they were sold a bill of goods by somebody who lied to them about why they were going. And that's to me, that's a crime. To me, that is setting up soldiers to die for reasons that are not honest. And I think that's using really good men and women for purposes that they very well might not agree with. But if you tell somebody that's it, there's a big surge in enrollments after and people signing up after 9/11. There was all this burst of we got to go get, and then you go in and people overthrow the government of Afghanistan because the Taliban was horrible, and then who runs Afghanistan now? It's remnants of the Taliban and people that are hardly any better than the Taliban. So then you have to wonder, wow, what was this for? Or you overthrow Saddam Hussein and it creates a power vacuum that leads to directly, as every one of us who were against that war said it would, something even worse than Al-Qaeda. So here we are at a moment in time when I feel as though those 7,000, however many lives American soldiers have died since those wars began. It's between 7 and 10,000, I guess, depending on what number. I haven't seen it recently. I think they have been sacrificed, and I think it is horrible for their families, and I think it's horrible for this country, and I think they deserved better. And I think part of what the protest of the anthem or any of that is about is saying we can do so much better. We can do better not only by people in the streets of this country who might be brutalized by cops. We can do better for soldiers. We can actually create a world in which the military that their mission is consonant with the values of the country. And I just think too often we haven't done that. That's not your fault, and that's not the fault of the soldiers on the front lines who are being sent to do this job for other people who themselves are not brave enough to do it, I suppose. But it is something that we as a country need to concern ourselves with precisely because we do care about you. Precisely because we do care about the soldiers who are being put in harm's way, theoretically to defend us. Well, if someone's going to be put in harm's way to defend me, I want to make damn sure that they aren't going there for a lie. I want to make real sure that they're going there for the reasons that have been articulated that are legitimate and for reasons that we can get behind, precisely because I care about them, not because I don't. But thank you very much for the question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, in your speech, you began it with a phrase where you had said that it's like a shame for us to be still talking about diversity in this day and age instead of talking about equity. But your speech was more about things that have been coming up in the news lately than about equity. So my question's in the spirit of equity. Yeah. A critique that people have made about you or around you is that institutions hire you to come and speak in lieu of making actual changes. A phenomenon that's happened before. People protest, they can hire you, you'll come and you'll do your best to educate the populace, but nothing really needs to change. So here at K-State, I know for a fact that although there are good people who work in and outside of the university, no one throw eggs at me, you can be able to see that people have been complaining. Our American Ethnic Studies department has complained about their lack of support. There are student groups who complain about their lack of support. There hasn't been big institutional pushes to make that better. So in the spirit of amplifying black voices, which is why we're here right now, can you take a few moments to talk about the importance of supporting things like American Ethnic Studies at K-State, or the importance of being able to support black student groups or make institutional changes?
Right. Well, I mean, clearly the purpose, I hope, and I gather, for having any kind of public presentation, right, whether it's by me or whether it's by a scholar of color who comes in to give a lecture, or whether it's, whatever it is to raise awareness about these issues, both as regards, the larger society and also at the local, more direct campus level. I think we can accomplish that with events like this, and then the question is, what do people do with that energy? Now, that's up to you, and I don't have any control over that. nor do the people who invite me in. I suspect that I get invited in on the premise that by adding another voice to that, that perhaps that will make a difference. Can I demonstrate or prove that it has? Well, I mean, I know some institutions that have certainly moved in a better direction. I'm not going to take credit for that. That would be absurd. There have been a lot of people, my voice just being one of them, that adds to that and maybe helps to bring that about. So we don't know for sure, right? That remains to be seen. I think as far as this institution is concerned, for those who were inspired by the talk or revved up by the talk, the key is, what do you do? And I do think that even though a lot of the talk focused on these bigger picture national items, obviously you start where you are, right? Obviously you start local, and then you move in these concentric circles outside of the local. You do that as a practical matter. It's not ethical or moral that you do that. It's just practically you start where you are. And so here what that means is obviously fighting for, whether it's curriculum reform, which was alluded to by one of the previous questions, whether it is outreach and recruitment, whether it's funding for a center of some sort, whether it's funding for student orgs, whether it is the full funding and support of particular departments. I mean, there are as many possibilities as you can imagine. The key is going to be how many people are showing up for those moments and those protests and those activities and those teach-ins and those whatever it is that's happening. How many people are demanding some institutional policy to deal with those kinds of moments like happened recently with the blackface incident? What is that policy going to look like? And I realize that right now this institution is in some flux administratively, but that's not always going to be the case. And I think one of the things right now that the institution and all of its members ought to be doing is saying, hey, in this moment of flux where we are looking for someone to take the reins of this institution on a non-transitional but more permanent basis, this needs to be part of the criteria that is considered for who gets that gig, and not just that gig, but any gig underneath that, or any department head position, or any type of administrative or staff position. That's something which you are going to have to demand. I could come in here and say it, and I just did, and it won't mean anything unless there are people, and not just the usual suspects who always demand these things, but those who are co-conspirators or accomplices saying, yes, we need this as well to be part of the criteria. That's the only way that it's going to change. And the awareness piece is good, and even if you can only put certain pieces of it into play in your life in years to come, it still has value. But right now, while you're here in this institution, you need to be pushing for those kinds of changes that are implied by the question that were suggested by the question over here a second ago, and that I think you all know just from paying attention to what's been going on in the institution are in the forefront of people's minds. And that's going to require some real determined demands and action and a willingness to back that up. We've seen in the last couple of years a resurgence of really vital activism on college campuses. We've seen it at Missouri. We've seen it at a lot of campuses. We've seen it at Yale. We've seen it all around the country. And so I think that there is a fervor for this kind of discussion right now that's unlike anything. I said at the outset of the speech that it's a very dangerous moment, maybe the most dangerous in 25 years that I've seen. But it's also, in other ways, one of the more hopeful moments in 25 years, because I haven't seen this level of activism and ferment around issues of justice in that 25 years as I've seen in the last 3 or 4. Part of that growing out of the Black Lives Matter movement, but extending beyond that, right, to these other issues of campus climate. And so I think you're at a particular point where if you tap into that and you demand something better during your time here, and you train that next group of students who are coming after you, because the thing about student activism is, lots of times administrations just wait your ass out until you graduate. And I know what that's like. It's like, oh, you'll be gone in 4 or 5 years, and then, a new crop of students. So it has to be this ongoing, each one, teach one, train that next group of people coming up to take the reins of that. And I think if you do that, there can be some real dramatic changes. And if not, there probably won't be. And we'll just keep having these conversations, which, again, have some value, but not as much value as the question implied. Yes?
Thank you for staying so long and answering our questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll do another 10 minutes or so. We're good.
My name is Heather Moore. I work as an advisor on campus. I'm a student myself, and I also teach. I'm keenly interested in how racism affects the prison system. Can you talk a little bit, as you have so far, about how we've lost voting rights for African American men in particular, as far as them not being able to contribute to our political climate,
Right.
and also how racism looks in our prison system for so many that may not be aware.
Right. Well, I think the number is, and I could be off on this, so if I am, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 1 in 7 African-American males, roughly, are disenfranchised in this country as a result of either restrictions on persons who are serving, obviously, or on probation or parole being able to vote, but even in a few states, ex-felons who have served their time are no longer on probation or parole in at least 2, if not 3 states. Used to be more. Now I think it's 2 or 3, still unable to vote for life. So about 1 in 7, which is, not inconsequential. And in some states, it's quite a bit more than that. It's 1 in 3 or it's 1 in 4 in states like Florida, for instance, where that makes a real difference in elections. And we have to understand the history of those felon disenfranchisement laws are directly traceable to the system of white supremacy. It wasn't an accident that they were passed. They were passed very deliberately during the period of the black codes, particularly in the South, where just about anything a black person did could be criminalized. So if you didn't have a job and you were found walking the roads looking for work and didn't have one and didn't have a sponsor, you could be arrested on charge of vagrancy. And then depending on how they decided to charge that, you could be charged with a felony and then you could potentially be disenfranchised. So a lot of these laws trace directly to that and continue to have a racist effect, of course, but even in intent, they were originally set up for that purpose. Beyond that, what we see currently, and let's just look at it over the last 50 years roughly, 52 years. In 1964, 2 out of 3 people locked up in this country, federal, state, and local, were white, and 1/3 were black or brown. By 1994, 30 years later, 2/3 of everybody locked up were black and brown, and only 1/3 were white. Now, in 2016, it's about 62-38, 62% people of color, 38% white. Now, obviously, that flip-flop since 1964 isn't the result of white people just like shaping up in 1965 and being like, screw this crime thing, we're done, and it's not the result of black and brown folks going crazy and committing more crime than ever. The rates of crime, white, black, Latino, et cetera, are roughly the same. The Latino rate's higher just because the Latino population's higher, but their rates of criminality are basically the same per capita as non-Hispanic whites, as the Census Bureau calls us. So that flip-flop isn't about criminality per se. It's about where the criminal justice resources have been deployed, and they have disproportionately been deployed in certain communities and not others, mostly with regard, or most disproportionately with regard to the so-called war on drugs, so-called because obviously and it is true, that the CDC and every other source says that white folks use drugs, possess drugs, and sell drugs at rates that are comparable, if not identical, to people of color. That's the truth. And yet people of color are 3 times, 4 times, even in some states 9 times more likely to be arrested for drugs. Then clearly there's something going on that ain't about drugs. Nationwide, black folks 4 times more likely to be busted for weed, even though rates of marijuana usage are identical. For young people between the ages of 12 and 25, white folks actually have higher rates of use for virtually every category of drug, and especially harder drugs. Much more likely to use. White young people, much more likely to have used cocaine, even more likely to have smoked crack, more likely to have used heroin. Now, the good news is very few kids do this, so the numbers for everyone are pretty low. But if we have to get into percentages, they're actually higher, or at least equally high for whites. So the war on drugs is not about that. It is a mechanism of black and brown folk control, not drug control. And I know this, by the way, not because of statistics. I also know it from personal experience, because if the war on drugs were about drugs, I'm not sure who would give this lecture tonight, but it wouldn't have been me, because fairly confident they don't let you Skype in a lecture from prison, and that is where I would be if the war on drugs were really about drugs. And I can say that because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit. So they can't touch me now. But that's real. Like, the only reason I didn't spend a significant amount of time in prison, is because my whiteness insulated me from the suspicion that would have attached to virtually anyone else. I mean, I remember coming back from a debate tournament in college that was at University of Texas, San Antonio, and I was driving back to New Orleans. And in the car with me, my debate partner, the other debate team, and our coach
this is Facebook Live. Should I cut it? Or?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, the statute of limitations has expired on this shit.
I don't want to be the one that takes
And the
him
coach
right down.
OD'd several years ago, so he's not going to say anything. I mean, you know. He had a real drug problem, real bad. Anyway, no, you can keep this shit going. I don't care. We're driving. We come through a place called Gonzales, Texas. I don't recommend it. And I get, yay, Gonzales. And I get stopped. I was going 8 miles over the speed limit. I don't remember if that was 73 and a 65 or if it was 63 and a 55. It was 1988. I'm not sure what it was. But I know it was 8 miles over. And lights come on, pull over. And I get a little nervous. And I get nervous because I know what's in the car. In the briefcase of the debate coach is probably, I'm guessing, 1.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of Coke, 12 sheets of acid, and about half a dozen hits of X. It is enough, and I've looked it up statutorily, to have sent us all to prison for a very long time in the state of Texas. The cop comes to the door. By the way, this is on Facebook Live. The other debaters might not have known. The coach and I knew what was in there. I'm not sure about my partner and the other debaters. I don't think they used. But so if they see this, don't be shocked. It's all good. You came that close to going to prison, but so.
Wait, were they white? They were all right.
One was a person of color, 2 were white, the coach was white. And the cop comes to the door, and I'm trying to find my ID, and I'm having a hard time because I'm nervous again about what's going on, and I'm looking, and I can't find it, and I just can't. I'm looking through my wallet, I cannot find it. And so he's like, why don't you come back to the cruiser and, you know, sit in the car. I've got a better light in there, and maybe you can find it. And I said, okay. So I get out and I go to his car, and he's right. It's a really good light in the cop car. Scary good light. And I'm going through my wallet, and I still can't find it. And then I come to my fake ID, which he sees. And he's like, isn't that it? I'm like, no, that's something else. I don't know. That's another kind of ID. Just so happens to say driver's license on it, but, you know. And he's like, are you sure? And he starts to reach for it. And at that moment, I find my real license. And I pull it out, and I'm like, oh, thank God, here it is, you know. And he accepts it. Now, he had to know that that was a fake ID, which in and of itself is a arrestable offense. And the way I was acting, I have no doubt, if I'd been a person of color, acting with that level of nervousness with 5 young people in the car, I'm absolutely confident that that car would have been searched, and we would have been arrested, and I would have been done with college, and I would have been serving time. That is how real and how random shit is. Or actually not random, right? But how your life can turn on a moment like that. Where the justice system decides to deploy its resources and where it doesn't. Stop and frisk in New York was a perfect example. The data says white folks in New York, just as likely, if not more likely, to use drugs, just as likely to have a weapon on them, contrary to popular belief, and yet they're not the ones being stopped and searched. And so that ends up affecting who goes to prison and who doesn't. And then once people are in prison, the other aspect of race that we don't talk about very much is, you know, if you keep in mind that 80-some-odd%, maybe 90-some-odd% of all incarcerated persons will be coming out at some point. They're not in for life, and they're not going to die in there. 85, 90-some-odd, I've heard, what is the number? 95%. 95% will be coming out. And yet, what do? Well, what we do is we lock people up, not with an eye toward restorative justice and toward anything remotely resembling rehabilitation, unless you count, you know, working for pennies on the dollar for some private company rehabilitation, which it's not. It's just slave labor, in effect, or nearly slave labor. What we do is we put people in and then we segregate them, and in fact do so in a way that actually reinscribes racial tension. So you put people in prison, and they'll tell you they do it for good reason. Well, we have to put the black folks over here and the Latino folks over here and the white folks over here because otherwise they'll kill each other. Well, maybe if you had a program that was aimed at breaking down all that bullshit, that wouldn't happen. But in fact, the jailers, the wardens benefit from that level of division. That's how they maintain control. They maintain control because they don't want the inmates to actually come together and figure out that there's some bullshit being run on all of them. They don't want that because they're afraid that if the inmates actually figure out this game, and and the prison guards are interesting, nervous people who, and I've met some who I think are being played as much as anyone. I remember meeting a guy, I did anti-death penalty work in Tennessee for about a year and a half in the early 2000s, and the first time I ever went to death row, I remember meeting the guy who was the guard on duty that particular day, young dude, 24, 5, 6 years old. And I mean, like, new to the job, his suit didn't even fit. It was like 2 sizes too big, and he was a real nice kid. And I remember talking with him, and he said, I was asking him about the job and what he thought about it, and, he's guarding these quote-unquote killers, some of whom actually were guilty, some of whom I believe to this day were not, and a few of whom have actually been exonerated and certainly were not. And I said, what's your take on this? And he said, it's interesting, man. He said, that guy over there, in that cell, he's a fantastic artist, and this guy over here writes really great poetry, and this guy over here writes these amazing short stories, and this guy over here, he's going through this list of the humanity of these supposed monsters that society's been told are so dangerous that they don't only have to be kept away from us, they have to be exterminated. They have to be actually literally put down like animals. And he's going through it. He's telling me like 8 or 9 guys. And finally, I see his look changes, and he stops, and literally mid-sentence, he stops, and he says, but I can't think about that. And I said, what do you mean you can't think about that? And he said, I can't let myself think about that, because if I think about that, I'll forget why they're here and what my job is. And I began to realize that there's something really undignified about a culture, about a society that requires somebody to put aside their sense of a common humanity just to put food on their family's table and just to pay their bills, because this kid could see the common humanity he had with people who we have deemed the worst of the worst, whether or not that's a fair appellation. That's what we've deemed them to be. And he realizes they're more than the worst thing they ever did, as we all are. We are all more than the worst thing we ever did. God help us if we were judged by the worst thing we had ever done. Well, these individuals had been, and look, I have no qualms about it. One of the individuals on death row at the time actually killed a friend of mine when I was 11 years old, so I know a little bit about the pain and the trauma of losing someone you care about to someone who has decided in that moment to take their life. But I also know that if we continue to divide us as people into the good and the bad, the evil and the sacred, the sort of angels and devils, and then we do it again by race and keep people pitted against one another, right? And then keep them all pitted against the guards and the guards against the inmates, instead of recognizing that most of those people who are locked up because they're poor or working class. If they weren't, they wouldn't be there. Most of those people that are working as guards or cops are there because they're working class. If they were rich, they'd have a different job, right? There comes a point where we've got to start talking about how to build solidarity across not only lines of race, but even across these artificial lines of enforcer and enforced upon. And if we don't do that, we're doomed. And so I hope that we will take very seriously the obligation to come up with a different kind of justice system, one that's based on principles of restorative justice, one that actually says that we're capable of taking offenders, and maybe not in every case. I'm not so naive as to think that every offender is capable of engaging in a restorative justice process, because restorative justice requires that one is prepared to take accountability. Restorative justice requires that one is willing to acknowledge one's crime and one's injury upon another person, and some folks just ain't there yet. But if we had a system that made it possible for them to actually be accountable and to restore a victim or a victim's family to the greatest extent possible, might we see a different society? And I believe the answer is that we would. So we need to start teaching those principles, thinking about how that could be done in the culture of law enforcement, in the culture of prisons. At the end of the day, I believe there are very few people, very few, statistically an insignificant number, who actually need to be locked away from us. I'm not saying that there aren't any, but the fact that we've got 7 million people under control of the criminal justice system, roughly 2.5 to 3 million actually under bars right now behind bars, is absurd. There is no reason for that. There may be thousands who have to be kept away, but that is a pittance of what is currently locked up in this country, which is to say that we really need to move toward a notion of the abolition of imprisonment as a way of dealing with criminality. There have to be better ways for dealing with about 99 to 99.5% of people who criminally offend. And that is both true racially, economically, and in every other way within the system of incarceration.
And one more thing, please.
Yes.
Just to keep in mind that there are so many people who have not even fairly made it through the justice system that are paying the prices for what they did not do.
Right.
And a lot of those are the minorities, specifically African Americans.
Right.
We haven't even gotten to the point of rehabilitating what wasn't broken. The justice system is the one that was broken.
Right. Well, and we have thousands and thousands of people who are not even adjudicated guilty of a crime yet, who are sitting in jails, waiting for trial, and some of them will no doubt end up like Khalif Browder, dead after sitting at Rikers for, 2.5 years for a crime that was never even adjudicated. And that's the kind of thing that happens to people in this country. When you look at the holding cells that we put people in who haven't been found guilty of anything, putting aside whether or not incarceration is the legitimate path even for people that have been convicted, we're talking about people who haven't even been convicted of anything, who are sitting waiting for trial. And the only reason they're waiting and they're not out on bail is usually not because of the severity of the crime. It's usually because they don't have money, which is to say it is debtor's prison. That's why they're in jail. That's why they're sitting there awaiting trials, because they don't have dough. If they had dough, they would have bailed out. The vast majority of no bail decisions are not based on the severity of the offense. It's not because, it's just such a severe crime that we can't bail you out. It is because we would bail you out if you had the money, but you and your family don't, so you'll sit here. And you might end up being, the charges might end up being dropped. You might end up being adjudicated not guilty. The DA may decide to drop all the charges, and now 3 years later, you've been sitting in jail, or 8 months later, now you can't get work because you've had 8 months without a job or 2 years without a job, so now you've got this big gap in your work history. Now you haven't been able to make any money to give back to the family. I mean, it just creates this vicious cycle that I think we have to be very, very conscious of. It's not helping communities. It's not keeping communities very safe. We know that there are ways to reduce criminal offending that have very little to do with what happens on the back end. That's what you do when the system is broken down. Incarceration is evidence of failure, right? It's evidence that we didn't take care of shit on the front end. And if we were really taking care of things on the front end, it'd be a pitifully small number of people who we actually had to, quote unquote, put away from the rest of us. And even then, there's no reason, even for those people who were truly, just because they're psychopathic or sociopathic at a degree that can't really be, quote unquote, fixed, there's still no reason to brutalize them. There's still no reason to put them in solitary confinement for years at a time and act like they're not human beings. I mean, that's just something that shouldn't happen even to the quote-unquote worst person. There's no reason to treat them like they're not a human being. And yet that's what we do in far too many cases. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
My name is Lincoln. I want to thank you for coming to K-State. I was wondering if you think those with very nostalgic views, some extreme Trump supporters, would ever start a civil uprising if Hillary were to win?
I actually wrote about this shortly before I came over here on Twitter in like this 15-point Twitter storm because I've been thinking about that a lot, and I've been writing about it for a while. A few years ago when I wrote Dear White America, which was looking at sort of the Tea Party phenomenon and some of the really, overtly racist stuff that was being said at that time about insurrection and about how, we want our country back. My argument then was we're coming to this point in the history of white anxiety that's very frightening, right? It's that point where, and I said it at the time, I'm afraid if these people look around and they realize that they can't win in an election anymore, maybe because the demographics have shifted, the culture has shifted, there are just enough young folks who see the world differently than maybe their parents did that they can't win. What do? And now I think that anxiety is ramped up much more even than it was in 2009 and 2010. And I'm honestly very concerned because when I look at not all Trump supporters, and I want to, make this clear, I know that there are, I'm sure, people who are going to pull that lever or push that button for Donald Trump who are not among those who I'm about to discuss. But I don't think there's any doubt that there is a hardcore contingent of Trump supporters, those who have been with him since the beginning, those who are among the most militant of the alt-right, which I preferred when they just went by their honest name, white supremacist, but whatever, who have made it very clear. It's not speculation on my part. The shit's in my email right now. I guarantee when I get back tonight, I will have 5 more of them. And I will have 7 more Twitter notifications. And I will have 15 comments on Facebook from people who will tell me, got one last night quite openly, you had better pray that Donald Trump wins. Because if he doesn't, we will declare all-out war on the left and the globalists, and we will destroy you. So they're promising it. This isn't me speculating. It is them saying this is what's coming. So now we have to think about some things. Because I think win or lose Donald Trump's vote, right? Because if he wins, there's no doubt they feel empowered and emboldened to attack those whom they are being encouraged to hate, because they figure his Justice Department will never prosecute it, right? So all that stuff we're seeing, some of the hate crime activity that we're seeing already in the last couple of months, increase in attacks on Muslims higher than any time since right after 9/11, attacks on Latino and Latina peoples, attacks on people in the Sikh community just because people think they're Muslim and don't know the difference and don't care, and it's just, oh, you look Middle Eastern, I'll attack you, even though many of the Sikhs they're attacking are from India, but whatever. Like, you know, they just don't care. They don't care about knowing anything about anything. They just see somebody that looks different, and so we've seen this uptick. I think if he wins, you're going to see more of that, because even if he isn't behind that, and who knows what he really believes and doesn't believe, I don't think there's any way to really nail that down. But many of his people would be empowered. If he loses, I fear that, I want him to lose. But if he loses, I think we best not be naive about the idea that somehow his hardcore base are the kind of people who are good losers. I don't see that. I don't see them being the kind of people that look around and go, gosh darn it, we tried. I guess next year we'll just have to do more phone banking, and maybe in 4 years we'll win the next time. I don't see that. I see them looking around and saying, we don't have the votes. Well, first of all, they're going to look around and think that it was stolen, because he's already told them that. He's already said they're going to steal it. What happens when you combine that sort of conspiratorial paranoia that's being fed every day by people that are far more extreme even than him, right? Far more. The people that he taps into, far more extreme than he is. And then you combine that with, because they think he's going to win. Among the messages that I'm getting, seriously, this is will blow your mind. So if you look at any respectable pollster, any of them, even the ones that normally lean Republican, like Rasmussen and others, every last one of them right now says that Hillary Clinton has a 5-point lead, if not an 11-point lead, 7-point lead, 6-point lead. No respectable pollster with a history of getting anything right disagrees with that. And yet, I'm getting messages on a daily basis from his people who literally believe it's going to be a landslide. Trump's going to win 40 states or more. It's going to be like Reagan versus Mondale in 1984. And they base this on the basis of these instant polls that come out right after the debates, where you can go and vote 5 times, and people on Reddit are telling everybody who's a Trump supporter, go vote, and all the 4chan idiots are, I'll go vote, blah, blah, blah. And they're all voting 15 times. And these polls, there was one at Breitbart that said it was 91-7 Trump. And they're like, see, it's a landslide. Because social science doesn't mean shit to these people. It's just well, it's 91-7. If you think that's going to happen, and they really believe it, and then all of a sudden, your reality is so not reality, I think that these are people who were they stole it, and they look around and they go, we don't have the votes, but we got a lot of guns. Right? 3% of the population has, 50% of the guns? Was that the data from 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago? And I know where those guns are at. So we had better be very cautious and be very prepared. And I'm not telling anyone what that means for you or your family, but just understand, things are about to get real, really real. If they're not already, it's about to get ugly before it gets better. And we had better be prepared. The only way that doesn't touch off in a way that is especially violent, and I think there's going to be isolated cases of violence no matter what we do, but the only way that it doesn't touch off in a really horrible kind of cataclysmic kind of way is we who are white and are done with this shit are going to have to stand up and insist that these folks don't speak for us. It's very obvious they don't speak for people of color. But until we turn on our families, until we turn on our neighbors, until we turn on our colleagues and say, enough, you don't speak for me, what you believe in, I don't believe in, and I will fight to the death to prevent from becoming the reality in this country, until we plant doubt in the minds of these people because they believe they speak for white America. They really fundamentally believe that it'll just be people of color who steal the election and a handful of white feminists, right? As opposed to a coalition of people who were saying no to this guy. And we're going to have to stand up. That's where accomplice and solidarity really come into play, because only if we let them know, hey, if you want to wage war on these folks, just know you're waging war on your nephew and your niece and your neighbor and the person who works next to you. We have to be bold enough to say, if you come for them, you come for us. And if you come for us, we will take you before you take us, and we're not afraid of you anymore. And we have to be prepared to do that. We have to be prepared at every level, I believe, to do that. But I appreciate the question. Yes, real quick.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was just in the extent of, this journey of life that you've been on, what is the greatest personal sacrifice that you've had to make, and what have you come to understand most deeply about who you are?
I think the most important sacrifice has been the sacrifice of the assumption of safety for my family, if not for me. I'm not really worried about my own safety, going back to this question a second ago. I mean, I'm not worried about it, but I don't obsess about it because I made a choice as to what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to be about. The sacrifice was having to give up any sense of real safety that I think certainly most white middle-class parents can take for granted for their kids. And I had to give that up because the reality is that those threats aimed at me are not only aimed at me. They're aimed at my children, my wife, my family, people that I love, and people whose safety I'm at least in part responsible for. And I have to live every day with the reality, because they tell me every day, or at least a few times a week, that not just myself but my family are in the crosshairs, in their crosshairs. And I have to go to bed with that, and I have to wake up with that. Most people, don't go to bed every night realizing that there are people who want them specifically dead and who want their children specifically by name to be dead. Now, people of color, of course, know that they live in a society that doesn't care if they die, in many cases, that allows their death and sort of just shrugs it off. But most people don't necessarily go to bed thinking there's a bullet with my name on it tonight, and I do. And I'm not okay with it, but I certainly know that it's been a sacrifice for my kids and for my wife and for me, because I have to transmit that fear to my children. And as a result, they grow up paranoid about who they can tell and who they can't tell where we live. When my youngest daughter was in 4th grade, she was 10, and she came home one day, and I asked her what went on that day, and she said, we had a contest to win a copy of A Wrinkle in Time, I think is the name of that book, right? Famous book. And her favorite book at the time that she'd ever read. And it was going to be signed by the author, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And she said, yeah, but I didn't enter it. And I said, well, why didn't you enter it? You love that book. Why wouldn't you enter the contest? And she said, well, because if I enter the contest, I'd have to put our address down. And I know I can't let anybody know our address. And I said, oh, Rachel, the school already knows your address. Like, it's okay for them to know. But it hit me right in that moment. Like, the cost is that I have a 10-year-old child who not only has to think about their father coming to harm, but themselves, and herself in that case coming to harm. That's pretty shitty. But I do it because it's an obligation and it's a risk that we now have all taken on. The biggest lesson I've learned about myself, I guess, is that I don't, it's funny because when I tell that story, or when I talk about death threats or talk about that stuff, there's usually someone who will sort of misinterpret what I'm saying and think that that's brave of me. And actually what I learned about myself is I'm really not brave at all. What I've learned about myself is that I am actually an incredible coward. And what I mean by it is facing the prospect of death at the hands of someone who wants to silence me, although that's frightening, isn't nearly as frightening to me as what happens if this culture does not right itself. I am so deathly afraid of what happens, not just to me, but to everyone else if we don't get this shit straightened out, that I do the work not because I'm brave. I will run into that shitstorm of hatred and contempt precisely because I'm a coward, precisely because I don't want to see what's at the end of the road if we don't get off that road and detour in a different direction. So what I learned about myself was that I'm really ultimately a coward, but that's okay, because we all ought to be. We all ought to be really afraid, like horribly, deathly afraid, so much so that we will do anything to avoid where that road leads. And coming to that recognition was sort of good, because what it allowed me was a certain degree of humility that is hard to come by when you're a pseudo-public figure, right? When you're a pseudo-public figure in this country, it's real easy to not have any humility. And I've certainly had my moments where I was insufficiently humble. But most of the time, I'm pretty decent about that, because I realize I ain't brave. I'm not courageous. I'm a coward. I'm doing this so as to stave off some really cataclysmic shit for everybody, and that I'm too afraid to face. Like, I just don't want to deal with it, and I don't think anybody should want to deal with it. And that actually allows me to not feel big and bad and puffed up in the least, right? It's just sort of like, oh, you know, that's the humanity, that's the human piece that we all deal with, and learning to accept that has been really helpful to me, at least. Yeah. I'm gonna do this, and that, and then all three, and then we'll be done.
Okay. This question kind of segues well with your children being elementary school age. So growing up, learning about history as it pertained to race in school was very different. At home, I had 2 black parents, a black family, than it was in school. I was kind of taught or the curriculum is set up so that Martin Luther King gets killed and racism disappears. Mm. So I was wondering if you could speak about racial history, or the lack of, taught in elementary school and other levels of education, and how you would go about reforming that.
Well, I think, and it goes back to what I said in the speech, that the reason that we don't do a real good job teaching that stuff, or a very comprehensive job or an honest job, is because the people whose job it is to do the teaching were once students who weren't taught any of that themselves. And you can't teach what you don't know and what you've never been taught. And so it's not a surprise that very few teachers, even really good ones, very talented ones, get it right or know what they're doing in that regard. Now, that's no excuse, but it is a reason. So then we have to figure out, okay, from there, what does that mean for us? I think, until we have, again, going back to what we were talking about with K-State, unless we have a requirement and an expectation that teachers, before they are set loose on children, have some competence around these issues, or at the very least have the intellectual curiosity to learn what they don't know. Because, again, if I don't know it yet, I can't keep you from teaching, but you got to at least show me that you're down to learn what you don't know. You have to actually show me that you're gung-ho to become conversant and expert to the greatest extent possible with this stuff. Unless we require that, and we don't currently, unless our teacher training institutions require it, and they don't. Most teacher ed schools programs offer electives in these kind of things that you can take, and then maybe you'll apply that when you get out there and teach. But it's not required. It's not required at all, and so some students do it and some students don't. Or they might just do one class, 4 hours, and then that's it, 4-hour credit. So I think we really have to have school systems and teacher ed schools that require these things, and I'm going to go beyond that. I actually want to say, and I've said this about policing as well, but I also believe it to be true with teaching. I think that particularly when it comes to schools that serve students of color in any significant numbers, I'd like this to be true in all schools, but especially schools that serve a significant number of students of color, and I don't know what the cutoff would be or the threshold, but just for now I'm just going to say significant numbers, whatever that might mean. I think it's really important, and certainly for schools that are located in communities of color. I think the community has to be involved in deciding who's going to teach their children. Just like I think the community has to be involved in who's going to police the streets. And by involved, I mean they get to choose. Like, in other words, for police and for teachers, if I'm going to teach in a community that is mostly of color, whether I'm white, by the way, or black or brown, doesn't matter, I should have to go in and demonstrate to the satisfaction of the community and of the parents that I not only sort of know what I'm doing when it comes to math and diagramming a sentence or whatever the hell it is that I'm being asked to teach, but that I also have not only the cultural competence, which, you know, is sort of a messy phrase, but whatever, but that I also have a sense of racial injustice and what is necessary to reduce racial inequities, not just in the curriculum, but in the assessment of students, in the discipline handed out to students, which we know is incredibly disparate and creates this sort of, you know, school to prison pipeline in state after state after state. I've got to actually demonstrate that I'm like aware of those things. And for policing, I think I have to be able to go in and demonstrate that my method and my idea of policing is in line with what the community wants, which is non-occupational, non-authoritarian, not domination and control and subordination. And then at the end of like a 6-month probation period in teaching or policing, the community gets to have a vote and they'll decide in or out. Right now we don't do that. Right now we turn really well-intended people who did 5 weeks of training with TFA loose on communities that they've never spent any time in. And we expect them to do well because they went to a good college and they know their content. And even the best intended of them oftentimes can't. So we just need to create different incentives and different structures, because it's never going to be enough to say, oh, here's some interesting curriculum you could use to fix the curriculum gaps. You actually have to select teachers and staff and counselors and administrators who have some grounding in issues of racial equity. You know, if you're going to have a guidance counselor, if they're not trained in the issues, both psychosocial and physiological, that people of color face when confronted with white supremacy, if they don't understand the physiological effect of microaggressions on children, if they don't understand those things, how can they counsel? Now, somebody might not need to know that in a really wealthy, affluent, overly white school. That might not be a skill set they need there, although it wouldn't hurt. But if you're in a community that serves people of color, you have to have that skill. If you're in a school that's two-thirds white and one-third people of color, still a majority white school, you better have some grounding in how that disparity is then replayed out in the AP courses or the honors courses or the disciplinary procedures, because we know that some of the most unequal schools are the ones that are 60-40 or 65-35, because we think they're all integrated and everything's good and everybody sort of gets along, but then you look at who's in the advanced level classes and you see the disparity. You look at who's getting suspended, expelled, referred to the office, you see the disparity. So I think we just need to have different selection mechanisms for who's going to be a teacher. And then I think if we do that, you'll start getting teachers who know where to look for that curriculum. They know where to look for the material. I've worked with a lot of elementary school teachers and even kindergarten teachers around how to do it. I think one of the things we ought to do in that regard as a starting place is really talking about and at a school district by school district level, creating media literacy projects for young people, because one of the ways that young people experience racialization the most, as well as gender objectification and class objectification, is media. Young people are imbibing media from the time they're very young, and they are seeing all kinds of images, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's video games, movies, television, music videos, whatever it is, and they can talk about it. I mean, I've had conversations with kindergartners about their media that they're watching, and no, it's not like PhD level sophisticated, but it's amazing what a kid can tell you about what they're seeing if you're willing to ask. So if our schools were starting to encourage young people, you know, what we usually do with young people is no more screen time, turn off that screen, stop looking at that, you know, read a book. Okay, I'm all for reading books. I write books. I like it when people read books. But at the same time, if young people are on the screen watching stuff, I don't mind that as long as we're prepared to have a conversation about what you're seeing at the end of that process. What are you seeing, and what are the messages about race? What are the messages about gender? What are the messages about class and religion and all these things? And I'm telling you, kids, if they learn to do that early, and if teachers are willing to venture into that territory and ask those kind of questions, they're amazingly capable of coming up with some really good answers. So I would start there. I think that's the most important place to start. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
All right. Okay, I have sort of a split question for you.
Mm-hmm.
White-collar crime is by far the largest type of crime committed, and under that umbrella falls environmental crime. You know, I mean, the crimes that pollute our rivers, you know, they destroy our waters. And
it's not even considered criminal, right?
Right.
Right.
It's not even considered a crime, which is absurd. But so often, this is done in areas that are poor as shit. You know, the reservations, also Appalachia. I mean, you've seen that.
Right.
And my question is, how do we get go about bringing the people in who don't see as to how this affects them.
Right.
Bring them in and show them how it does affect them. And also, when you go against these forces, you're hit with federal charges.
Yeah.
And when you're standing up against that, how do you do that in a legal manner when you have basically no recourse?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I think you raise a really important issue, and historically there have been some obviously really good efforts. They haven't always been sustained. In the 80s, I was involved in some of this in Louisiana. There were a lot of folks that were doing environmental racism work, and they were building some really incredible alliances between black communities along the Mississippi River that were, of course, disproportionately exposed to toxics, and also poor and working class white communities. Now, here's the challenge, right? And this is always the challenge. Right around the same time that was happening in Louisiana is when David Duke started running for office. And a lot of those white folks who were right there on the front lines of the environmental racism movement and shoulder to shoulder with black folks, like hand in hand with black folks, having dinner, plotting how they were going to take on the grain elevator company, or they were going to take on the oil company, or they were going to take on the chemical company, or the poultry processing plant. As soon as somebody came along and waved this shiny bauble of racism and race in front of them and said, "Oh no, remember, it's these people that are your problem." It was like a dog with a bell. You know. And so, and I don't know, you know, what it'll take to break through that, but I do know that that's the challenge, and I do think that there are, and this is the good news of the last few years. There's plenty of bad news too, but some of the good news is that I do think that in the last 4 to 5 years there has been a renewed awareness of economic inequality and the way in which the elite are manipulating, whether it's the financial system or whatever else, to their benefit at the expense of the 99.9% of people in the country. And I do believe that there is not only a renewed interest and an awareness, but a renewed willingness on the part of at least some working class white folks to put aside all that bullshit that has normally been a distraction and begin to take aim at things like corporate crime, things like environmental pollution, things like wage theft, you know, which is a great example of technically a white-collar crime, but it's 3 to 4 times more money lost every year to wage theft. That is to say, companies not paying their workers what by law they owe them. So it might be not paying for prep work if you work in a restaurant, paying under the minimum wage for certain work, working you off the clock, whatever it is. And 3 to 4 times more money are lost every year to that than all of the street and bank robberies and store robberies combined. 3 to 4 times more money. But here's the deal. If I'm a boss and I rip you off to the tune of $150 a month that I should have paid you, I'm not going to go to jail. At most, you might sue me, and you might recover if you can find an attorney and you have the money and the wherewithal to file a suit, and I might have to pay you back wages, but that's very rare. The typical fine for wage theft is a couple $100s. If, on the other hand, I work for you and I steal $150 out of the register, I'm going to go to jail, and possibly for several years. And so we have to raise these issues and point out that so much of what we're being encouraged to fear is not what we need to fear. The things that we're most afraid of, getting held up at gunpoint on the street, is far less likely. What's that?
I said it hardly ever happens.
And it doesn't happen all that often. It happens too often. And when it happens to you, you're not going to give a shit about wage theft, obviously. Right. I get it. But here's the reality, right, is that kind of crime has actually gone down by 38% in the last 30 years. Contrary to popular belief, violent crime is down, property crime is down. Even with all that we hear about cities like Chicago, interestingly, Chicago's violent crime rate today is still lower than it was 30 years ago. There's been a blip in this last 12 months, but overall lower than it was 30 years ago. The homicide rate in Washington is lower than it was since 1965. The black male homicide rate in America is lower today than it was per capita in 1950. These are things nobody will tell you because we have this interest in keeping us all convinced that, you know, these folks are living in hell and everything's horrible over here and they're all getting shot, and if you venture into their neighborhood, you'll get shot too. Meanwhile, you have a far greater likelihood of, you know, drinking polluted water, breathing polluted air, eating products that have been adulterated with all kinds of crap, that all of which is legal. You have far more of a risk of you know, lots of other things happening to you, usually as the result of actions by people with a lot more power and a lot more influence than poor people. And so how we bring that awareness, you know, we just have to keep talking about it. I think people are open to it when they hear it over and over. Repetition has its value. I used to think that it didn't. I used to feel like, oh crap, we're just banging our head against a wall. And I remember back, and this is sort of off the subject, but it's related, back in 2001, when there was one of several, for those who will remember these days, one of several school shootings that took place. This one was outside of San Diego in Santee, California. It was after Columbine. It was after several others. There had been 30 attempted or successful school shootings, almost all of them in white suburban spaces, right, by white suburban middle-class kids. And I wrote an article. I'd written several. Every time one of these happened in Springfield, Oregon, Kip Kinkle, I wrote about it. Happened in Columbine in Littleton, Colorado, I wrote about it. Happened in Santee, and I wrote again. And my argument was the reason this shit keeps happening in these quote-unquote nice, safe spaces is precisely because nobody thinks it can. They're also afraid of black and brown folks moving into the neighborhood, that they're not paying attention to the dysfunction that looks like them and has their same last name and lives in their basement, right? And is building bombs in the basement, by the way, and making videos, as happened at Littleton, at Columbine. Those two kids made a videotape, a movie for a class grade where they acted out the murder of their classmates and teachers on film and turned it in as a class assignment. And people weren't like, holy shit, call the cops. They were like, oh, interesting use of light and motion, B+, or whatever. And had they been black folks roll up with a film like, yeah, this is our movie. It's called The Day We Kill All of Y'all. I'm fairly confident that somebody's getting a call in the police department. But the white folks were like, oh, they're going to be movie makers. I got a little Steven Spielberg here. No, you have a killer here. But they let down their guard. So I said that. Fourth or fifth time I had said it. And I was like, screw it, I'm just going to say it again. People of color were saying it, and they weren't getting anywhere with it. I was saying it, I wasn't getting anywhere. And then I wrote that piece saying the same damn thing I'd said for 3 or 4 years. And interestingly, all of a sudden, it went viral. And that was back in 01 before there was such a thing. There was no social media in 01, so it just went viral via like websites and email listservs and stuff that doesn't even exist anymore, right? And I got like 8,000 emails in 4 months, and I responded to as many of them as I could. And what was interesting was all of a sudden you had these people who were coming out saying, I never wanted to believe this was true. I'd heard people of color say it. I'd even heard you say it or other people say it before, and I just always ignored it. But I realized, like, holy crap, like our white blindness is the problem. We're blind to our own pathology. Now, that doesn't mean there have been dramatic changes in issues of school security or the way that we view these things, but the fact that repetition at least got some people to go, damn, we need to really think about some of this dysfunction. Maybe that has prevented some incidents because maybe people are looking finally, not just because I said it, but because other people did. So the same thing is true here. I think if we beat the drum of that enough, that there's a real possibility that we can start to say, hey, why is it that we don't consider pollution criminal? Why is it that we don't criminalize corporate wrongdoing? Why is it that nobody really on Wall Street, well, maybe one person actually has gone to prison for everything that happened there? Why is it that we handle all of those things through the civil code, through lawsuits, through regulatory mechanisms, rather than criminal mechanisms? Well, it's because crime is about what powerful people decide crime is. Powerful people decide what's criminal and what's not, and they've decided that the wrongdoings of wealthy people will not be handled through the criminal code. That's a choice they made, and it's a choice that can be unmade if we make that clear enough that that's what we want. Yeah, thank you. Last one.
Okay. I had a question about equality. We talked about it a lot tonight, but my question was mainly specific for Islamophobia. I come from a perspective like half of my family was Christian, half of my family was Muslim, so that gave me a unique perspective, which I think a lot of people across the nation do not have. And so this is an increasing problem here at the U.S. And so what are things that we can do to decrease this tension, country-wise, state-wise, college-wise? What can we do in your what do you think we can?
Well, I think first we need to acknowledge how really Christian hegemony operates in our country. We're so used to thinking of ourselves as this religiously pluralistic place when really we're a pretty Christian hegemonic place, or maybe to some extent Judeo-Christian hegemonic, but really not so much of the Judeo, really sort of the Christian hegemonic. I'm Jewish, I'm from Nashville, all right, so every corner is 3 churches, and the fourth corner is a Walgreens. And so I know a little bit about Christian hegemony growing up in that kind of environment, and Muslim folk are certainly, if they didn't already know, discovering that in even greater regard because, and this is the important point to recognize, and we have to be clear about it, Islam has been and is being racialized in this country. So we have to speak of it as part of a larger phenomenon of white and Christian supremacy, in the sense that, but especially white supremacy, because Islam has been racialized. In a post 9/11 environment, we see Muslims as dark, regardless of their actual phenotype or what part of the world they're from, so much so that you'll recall after the Boston bombing, the Boston Marathon bombing, where the two bombers were indeed Muslim, but they were from the Caucasus Mountain region, which is the place from which white people gain our anthropological name as Caucasian. So in an anthropological sense, however we want to value that, these guys were whiter than me because my people are not from the Caucasus. And yet, did anyone see them as white? Not very many people did. In fact, if you looked at some of the news media representations, darkened their skin. There were cartoons being circulated in editorial cartoons that actually made them look more phenotypically, quote-unquote, Middle Eastern, which they are not from the so-called Middle East at all. So we just need to understand a little bit about how Islam has been racialized, and that means understanding history and understanding that Islam has been racialized for a long time and counterpositioned as this dark faith, counterpositioned against the lighter truth of Christianity. So there are both racial and religious overtones to that we have to understand. And our religious history is almost as badly understood and badly taught as our racial history. And so for the most part, we don't know very much about it, and we don't understand anything about Islam. And when anybody tries to teach anything about Islam, I mean, this just happened in where I'm from Tennessee, and there's a county in Tennessee, and I don't remember which one. It's not the one that we live in Nashville, but a smaller county where a mother is raising all kinds of holy hell, and her video went viral last week because the school, like elementary school or middle school, 5th grade or something, was teaching the pillars of Islam. That's it. Just like as a point of information, like these are the pillars of Islam, this is, the holy book of Islam, this is the name of the prophet, like real basic stuff. Like we need to go quite a bit deeper than that, but I guess that's a start for people that don't know any of that. And she's losing her mind. Well, you're trying to indoctrinate my child in Islam. Well, where does that come from? It comes from this hegemonic mindset that says that pluralism is by definition an attack on the one true faith. So we have to be real honest, I think, as a culture about the way that Christian hegemony leads to that mentality. Whenever anyone argues for pluralism, that's their response, is you're attacking my beliefs, you're attacking my faith, you are diminishing this one truth. And if you speak out against that, you essentially ally yourself with, the devil in their mind in some cases. So we have to be real willing, I think, to challenge that hegemony just like we challenge white hegemony, and to recognize how they're combined. But I think that's going to mean a lot of us who are not Muslim are going to have to put ourselves on the line. One of the things that was mentioned in the intro tonight for me was this thing about this quote of mine, or this paraphrase of something I said in this public dialogue that I had with Angela Davis back in 2011. We were talking about a case where, and it had just been in the news about a month or two before, 3 imams in the Twin Cities who had gotten on a plane at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, and they were praying before the plane takes off, which I see people do all the time. But they, of course, being imams and physically identifiable as such by the way they were dressed, scared some white people, apparently, some white non-Muslim people. And they reported it, and they got the pilot to ultimately escort these 3 men off the plane. And what I said in the public dialogue with Angela was, it was real nice in the wake of that there were people, non-Muslim people, who in solidarity with the Muslim community, wrote angry letters about that, tweeted about it, put it on their Facebook page, whatever. That's all fine. But at the end of the day, what we're going to have to start doing if we're serious about challenging that kind of Islamophobia is we're going to have to start getting up and getting our ass off the plane when that happens. literally and metaphorically, because it's not always in a plane. It might be somewhere else. It might be the service that we see a Muslim getting in a store. It might be the way in which law enforcement is speaking to someone who's identifiably Muslim. It may be the way people are being treated at the airport by TSA. I've certainly seen that as well. Unless we're prepared to actually challenge it, and in the case of being on an airplane, get up and inconvenience ourselves enough to actually exit the plane. And if we got somewhere to be, too damn bad. Like, unless we're prepared to actually then march to the office of the airline and say, again, not in our name, and do that in relatively large numbers over and over and over again, very little of that is probably very likely to change. So, of course, what that means is we have to educate ourselves about what this struggle is. We have to understand the way it's connected to race. We have to critique the Christian hegemony, which I think is at the root of it. And we have to, or at least a significant root of it, and we have to be prepared to put ourselves on the line when our Muslim brothers and sisters are being attacked, whether that is literally or figuratively. When a community does, as they did outside of Nashville 4 or 5 years ago, attempt to block the construction of a mosque, and this has happened in other parts of the country as well, we have to be there demanding that that kind of opposition be, although it is allowed, that it will be defeated, and that they will not be successful in preventing a mosque from being constructed because they have somehow convinced themselves that it's a recruiting station for the Muslim Brotherhood. We also need to have, I think, a very different foreign policy with regard to Muslim nations and those nations that are in that part of the world which is disproportionately Muslim, because the reality is that much of the tension that is created and generated in the world between Islam and non-Muslim peoples, including Jews in Palestine, is the result of nationalistic policies and colonial policies that have marginalized Muslim peoples. And I say that as a Jew who believes very much in the independence of Palestinian people and the liberation of Palestinian people from a system that they did not, in fact, vote for and nonetheless have had imposed upon them. We're going to have a very different policy vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel. We're going to have a very different policy regarding other Muslim nations as well. But I think much of the tension has to do with the way in which American foreign policy has consistently and regularly I think, contributed to the beef that exists not only in Palestine, but around the world in terms of who we support and who we don't support, who we've armed and who we don't arm, what is the level of technology transfer that we give to various countries, and how does that actually end up supporting Wahhabism, which is not indeed the form of Islam that the vast majority of Muslims either in the so-called Middle East or around the world believe in, but we've contributed to that. We have helped to create that. And so we have to change our policies, we have to change our way of understanding Islam, or just frankly begin to understand Islam. And we have to be prepared to question our own faith traditions. For me as a Jew, I have to be prepared to question the political Zionism that I was told as a Jew I had to support and have never, frankly, supported. And those who are Christian will have to really confront the sort of dominionism that is implicit in Western Christianity, even if not explicit, which holds all other faiths to be inferior. And until that happens, and that's a very hard place for most people to go, I fear that Islamophobia, and really more than Islamophobia, but really Christian supremacy and the consequent effects on Muslim people and anyone who isn't Christian will continue to play out in our country. So again, that's a job for all of us, and particularly those of us who are not Muslim, to join in solidarity with those who are. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all.